Just days after burying the love of my life, I dragged myself to my nephew's first birthday party, only to watch my sister clink her glass and make an announcement that stopped my heart. She told our entire family that my late husband was actually the father of her child. She shoved a piece of paper in my face, claiming it was his final will, and demanded half of my house as her inheritance. My mother immediately told me to stop causing a scene and hand it over. What they did not know was that I had a secret that made her claim biologically and legally impossible. I simply smiled, handed the paper back, and told them I needed to visit the bank. My name is Joanna, and I am 34 years old. Exactly 1 week ago, I stood in the freezing rain and buried David, my husband of 10 years. Before I tell you how a child's birthday party turned into the ultimate betrayal, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to defend yourself against the people who were supposed to love you most. I was still completely numb with the kind of grief that makes your bones ache. Drawing a single breath felt like a monumental task. Yet family obligation dragged me out of my empty house and into the bright, noisy backyard of my younger sister Monica's rental home. It was her son Leo's first birthday party. The yard was filled with extended family neighbors and loud children running through the sprinklers. The smell of barbecue and the sight of colorful balloons created a festive atmosphere that sharply contrasted with the heavy black mourning clothes I was still wearing. The gaping hole in my chest was almost too much to bear. David and I had spent years saving every penny from my job as a wealth manager to buy our dream home, a stunning $600,000 restored craftsman property. We had poured our hearts into that house, painting the walls, planting the garden, and building a secure life together. Now walking its empty halls alone was a daily torture. David was a good, honorable man. He was the absolute anchor of my life. Losing him to a sudden tragic accident had shattered my world completely. I stood near the edge of Monica's concrete patio, clutching a paper cup of warm water, just trying to make it through the afternoon without breaking down in front of everyone. Monica was 30 years old and had always been the golden child of our family. She was the one who could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of our parents, Harold and Susan. While I had spent my 20s working tirelessly to build a career and secure my future, Monica had bounced from one self-inflicted disaster to another, always expecting someone else to clean up her mess. Her most recent disaster was Kyle, the man we all believed was Leo's father. Kyle was a notoriously unreliable deadbeat who had skipped town months ago, leaving Monica to deal with past due rent and mounting credit card bills. Naturally, my parents rushed in to coddle her. They treated her like a helpless victim of circumstance rather than an adult who consistently made terrible choices. They paid her utility bills, bought her groceries, and constantly reminded me that I needed to be more supportive of my struggling sister. I was quietly staring at a pile of discarded wrapping paper when the sharp sound of a metal spoon tapping against a glass cut through the backyard chatter. Monica was standing at the center of the yard, holding a plastic champagne flute high in the air. The crowd quieted down instantly, turning their attention to her. She looked stunning, wearing an expensive new designer dress our mother had likely paid for, her hair perfectly styled. She cleared her throat and let out a shaky, theatrical breath. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate my sweet Leo today." Monica began, her voice carrying a practiced, delicate tremor. "As you know, this has been an incredibly difficult year for our family. Losing David has been a tragedy that none of us were prepared to face." She paused dramatically, wiping an invisible tear from her cheek. "But David's passing has made me realize that life is too short to keep secrets. I can no longer hide the truth from the people I love." The yard went completely silent. You could hear the wind rustling the leaves in the large oak trees. I frowned, a cold knot forming in my stomach. What secret could she possibly have about my husband? Monica took another deep breath and looked directly at me. "I am so sorry, Joanna," she said loudly, ensuring every single guest in the yard heard her clear as day. "But Kyle is not Leo's real father. David is." The world seemed to stop spinning. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of aunts, uncles, and neighbors. People covered their mouths in shock, their eyes darting back and forth between Monica and me. I stood frozen, my mind violently rejecting the words that had just come out of her mouth. She was claiming that she had slept with my husband. She was claiming that the nephew I had held and babysat and bought presents for was the product of a secret affair. Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of the accusation, Monica reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up for the stunned crowd to see. David knew the truth, she announced, her voice gaining strength and brazen confidence. He knew he was the father, and he wanted to do the right thing before he died. He updated his will to make sure his biological son was taken care of. She walked straight over to me and shoved the paper into my trembling hands. This document states that David wanted his biological son to inherit half of the house you currently live in, Monica declared. He wanted Leo to have half of the $600,000 estate, so his own flesh and blood would not be left out on the street. I demand that you honor his final wishes. I stared at the paper in my hands, unable to comprehend the sheer audacity of the moment. I expected my parents to step in to scold Monica for telling such a vile, disgusting lie so soon after a tragedy. But instead of defending me, my parents Harold and Susan immediately rushed to Monica's side. My mother wrapped her arms protectively around Monica as my sister buried her face in my mother's shoulder, sobbing loudly on cue. My father stood defensively in front of them, glaring at me as if I were the villain in this twisted scenario. Susan stepped forward, her face twisted into a scowl of profound disappointment. "Do not cause a scene." Joanna, my mother, snapped, her voice low but carrying enough for the nearest guests to hear. "You had David for 10 years. You had a perfect, comfortable life. It is time you share your blessings with your sister, who desperately needs it. She has a child to raise." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow, but they also unlocked a deeply buried memory. Standing there being told to sacrifice my life and my hard-earned assets for Monica, I was suddenly a teenager again. This mirrored a quick flashback to when Susan forced a teenage me to hand over my hard-earned college savings to pay off Monica's massive credit card debt. I had worked double shifts at a local diner for 2 years, saving thousands of dollars for my tuition. My mother took it all without a second thought, telling me that family protects family, and that my sister's shopping debts were a family emergency. I was forced to take out massive student loans, while Monica faced absolutely zero consequences. She was using the exact same manipulation tactics, now expecting me to simply surrender my home. The absolute betrayal from my parents was a familiar poison, but this time the stakes were my house, my marriage, and my late husband's honor. They were entirely willing to drag David's pristine reputation through the mud and destroy my life just to secure a massive payday for their golden child. The shock began to fade rapidly, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I looked down at the piece of paper still trembling in my hands. The document was typed in a generic font filled with pseudo-legal jargon that sounded like it had been copied and pasted from a cheap internet template. But it was the signature at the bottom of the page that caught my complete attention. I had spent 10 years married to David. He was a meticulous man, and I knew his handwriting better than my own. The signature on the paper was a clumsy, amateurish forgery. The slant of the letters was entirely wrong, and the heavy pressure marks indicated someone had drawn it slowly and deliberately, trying to trace a shape rather than signing their own name naturally. The sheer stupidity of the forgery was staggering. The anger that had been boiling in my veins suddenly evaporated, replaced by a profound, icy calm. I looked up from the forged document and met my mother's furious gaze, then shifted my eyes to Monica, who was peeking out from behind our mother's shoulder to gauge my reaction. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not fall to my knees in despair or give them the satisfaction of a public breakdown. Instead, I carefully folded the fake will and handed the piece of paper right back to my sister. I flashed a chillingly calm smile that made Monica's triumphant expression falter instantly. "Thank you for sharing this with me," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and unbothered. "I need to visit the bank." I turned on my heel, my sensible black heels sinking slightly into the manicured lawn, and made a straight line for the side gate. I did not want to scream. I did not want to give them the satisfaction of my tears. But before my hand could even brush the cold iron latch of the gate, a heavy arm slammed across the wood, blocking my exit. My father Harold stood there. His face was flushed, not with the grief of a grandfather who had just learned a shocking family secret, but with the aggressive, flushed entitlement of a man who saw a payday slipping through his fingers. "We are not done here, Joanna," he barked, stepping into my personal space so closely I could smell the stale beer on his breath. "You are going to do the right thing for once in your life. You are going to call a realtor tomorrow morning and put that house on the market. David wanted his son to have what is his, and you are not going to steal from a baby." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, yet a strange, icy detachment began to wash over me. I looked past his shoulder. My mother Susan and my sister Monica were watching us closely from the patio. They were not crying anymore. The theatrical sobbing had vanished the second I turned my back. Instead, their eyes were locked on me with a calculating, hungry intensity. They were waiting for me to break. "You have always been entirely selfish with your money," Joanna Harold sneered, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper intended only for me. "You hoard every penny while your sister struggles, just like when you refused to empty your savings to pay for Monica's wedding. You let her start her marriage in debt because you cared more about your down payment than your own flesh and blood. You owe her this." The sheer audacity of his statement was staggering. 5 years ago, Monica had demanded a lavish destination wedding she could not afford. My parents had already taken out a second mortgage to fund her lifestyle, and when the bills came due, Harold had actually demanded I drain my hard-earned house fund to pay the caterers. When I said no, I was labeled the selfish villain of the family. Now he was using that same twisted logic to demand the roof over my head. I did not engage. I did not defend myself or remind him that David had worked 80-hour weeks for years to afford our home. I simply looked into my father's eyes and saw the absolute truth. There was no shock. There was no confusion about Monica's sudden revelation. There was only raw, unadulterated greed. They were in on it, all of them. This entire birthday party, the dramatic clinking of the glass, the forged piece of paper, it was a coordinated ambush. They knew I was vulnerable. They knew I had barely slept since burying my husband a week ago. They assumed my grief would make me weak, compliant, and desperate to avoid a public scandal. They thought I would hand over a $300,000 check just to make the nightmare stop. "Move, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that I had never used with him before. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You cannot run from this, Joanna. We will take you to court. We will tell the newspapers. Everyone will know exactly what kind of greedy, barren woman you really are. You will be a pariah in this town." I did not flinch at his cruel words. Instead, I stepped firmly around him, using my shoulder to push his arm off the gate latch. He was so surprised by my physical resistance that he stumbled back a half step, giving me exactly the room I needed. I pulled the gate open, let it slam shut behind me, and walked briskly down the driveway toward my car. I could hear my mother's shrill voice calling out from the backyard, demanding I come back and finish this conversation like an adult. I ignored her. I unlocked my car with the key fob slid into the driver's seat and immediately hit the central locking button. The heavy thud of the locks engaging was the most comforting sound I had heard all week. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, as Harold appeared in my rearview mirror, marching down the driveway with his hands on his hips. I turned the ignition, threw the car into drive, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. As I navigated through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Monica's rental neighborhood, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright began to recede, leaving behind a surreal, hollow sensation. The silence inside the car was deafening. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from my mother. A text from Monica. Then another from my father. They were already mobilizing, already spinning their narrative. For 10 minutes, I drove aimlessly, my mind violently processing the magnitude of their betrayal. My own sister, my own parents. They were willing to drag my dead husband's name through the mud, brand him a cheater, and destroy my life, all for a payout. And then stopping at a red light, the sheer profound absurdity of the situation finally hit me. It started as a small tremor in my chest, a short puff of air escaping my lips, then a chuckle. Within seconds, I threw my head back and let out a sharp, loud, incredulous laugh that bounced off the windows of my empty car. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, my chest heaving with the absolute ridiculousness of their master plan. They had banked everything on a lie. They had risked their reputations, their relationship with me, and potentially their own freedom on a forged document and a fabricated affair. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a clueless wife who kept no records. They assumed David and I kept secrets from each other. They did not know that David and I were a unified front, an impenetrable team that shared everything. And more importantly, they did not know about David's medical history. The lie Monica had spun in that backyard was not just morally bankrupt, it was biologically impossible. David could never have fathered Leo. He could never have fathered anyone. The knowledge sat in my mind like a loaded weapon. My grief, which had been a suffocating weight just an hour ago, suddenly crystallized into sharp, focused armor. They wanted a war over my husband's legacy. They wanted to steal the home we built together. They had picked the wrong widow. The traffic light turned green. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. My original plan had been to go straight home, to crawl into my empty bed and hide from the world. But as I approached the intersection that would take me to my house, I bypassed the turn lane completely. Going home meant being a sitting duck. It meant waiting for them to show up on my porch with more demands and more forged documents. I needed to go on the offensive. I merged onto the highway heading straight toward the financial district downtown. My destination was the main branch of First National Bank, a towering glass and steel building where David and I kept our most sensitive files. The drive took 20 minutes, giving me ample time to compose myself. I wiped the tears of laughter from my cheeks, smoothed down my black dress, and checked my reflection in the visor mirror. The grieving, fragile woman who had walked into that birthday party was gone. In her place was someone cold, calculating, and ready to dismantle her family piece by piece. I pulled into the bank's underground parking garage, parked in a visitor spot, and took the elevator up to the main lobby. The bank was quiet, the afternoon rush having already subsided. I walked straight up to the customer service desk. The branch manager, a kind older woman named Mrs. Higgins, who had known David for years, looked up from her computer. Her eyes softened with immediate sympathy as she recognized me. "Joanna," she said softly, standing up from her desk. "I am so deeply sorry for your loss. David was a wonderful man. How are you holding up?" I offered a tight, polite smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins. I am managing as best as I can. I am actually here because I need access to my safe deposit box, the large one under both our names." Mrs. Higgins nodded understandingly, completely unaware of the domestic warfare that had just been declared across town. "Of course. I will take you down to the vault right now. Let me just get the master key." I followed her through the heavy security doors and down a carpeted hallway into the silent, climate-controlled vault. The air down here always smelled faintly of old paper and polished metal. Mrs. Higgins located our box, a large rectangular container near the bottom row. She inserted her key, and I inserted mine, turning them simultaneously. The heavy metal lock clicked open. "I will leave you to it," Mrs. Higgins murmured, stepping out of the small viewing room and gently closing the privacy door behind her. I stood alone in the quiet room, staring at the metal box resting on the table. David had always been a man who planned for every contingency. As a corporate lawyer, he understood the ugly side of human nature better than anyone. He knew how greed could twist people, how families could turn on each other when money was involved. 2 years ago, after a particularly disturbing incident involving Monica, David had insisted we open this box. He called it our disaster preparation kit, a joke between us that suddenly felt incredibly prophetic. I took a deep breath, unlatched the lid, and opened the box. The heavy steel door of the viewing room clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a quiet, sterile sanctuary. The thick walls completely blocked out the noise of the city above, and the polished mahogany table in the center of the room offered a stark contrast to the chaotic backyard I had just escaped. After the suffocating tension of my sister's party and the screaming accusations from my parents, the absolute silence of the bank vault felt like a physical embrace. I stood alone in the brightly lit room, staring at the heavy metal safe deposit box, resting squarely on the table. David and I had opened this account 3 years ago. We had jokingly called it our disaster preparation kit. Back then, the disasters we imagined were house fires or unexpected medical emergencies. Neither of us could have ever predicted that the true disaster would be my own flesh and blood trying to extort my home over my dead husband's grave. I placed my hands flat against the cold metal lid. My fingers were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had flooded my system when Monica dropped her vile bombshell. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the conditioned air fill my lungs. I flipped the dual brass latches. They popped open with a sharp, satisfying sound that echoed in the tiny room. I pushed the heavy lid back. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet lining, were pristine manila folders. This box was the physical manifestation of David's brilliant and meticulous mind. He was a corporate litigator who spent his entire career anticipating worst-case scenarios and building impenetrable defenses against them. He had protected me in life, and now looking at these files, I knew he was still protecting me in death. I reached into the box and pulled out the thickest folder first. The label on the tab read Estate Planning, written in David's sharp architectural handwriting. I opened the cover and slid out a stack of crisp, heavy bond paper. It was his actual ironclad will. My eyes scanned the familiar legal text drafted and notarized just last year by the senior partners at his prestigious law firm. The document was completely flawless. It contained all the proper seals, the watermark of his firm, and the signature of 3 independent witnesses. Every single paragraph was meticulously crafted to ensure that his entire estate, including his life insurance, his investment portfolios, and 100% of the equity in our $600,000 home, transferred directly to me. I traced my finger over his signature at the bottom of the final page. The ink was dark and confident. The contrast between this binding legal masterpiece and the pathetic internet-generated garbage Monica had waved in my face was almost comical. My sister had truly believed she could download a generic form, forge a sloppy signature, and override a document created by a team of ruthless corporate attorneys. Monica always thought she was the smartest person in the room. Our parents had spent 30 years reinforcing her delusions of grandeur, bailing her out of every financial mistake, and telling her she deserved the world on a silver platter. They had coddled her into a state of supreme arrogance. But arrogance breeds carelessness. By presenting that fake will in front of 24 witnesses, she had not just lied. She had committed a severe felony. I placed the real will carefully on the polished table. That was piece of evidence number 1. I turned my attention back to the metal box and pulled out the second item. It was a dark, leather-bound journal. Seeing it brought a fresh wave of grief, but it was quickly swallowed by a surge of vindictive energy. I knew exactly what this book contained. David had started keeping this journal 2 years ago, at the strict advice of his law partners. It was a comprehensive handwritten log documenting a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior from my sister. I opened the book to the middle and began reading the entries. Page after page detailed every single time Monica had made inappropriate, highly aggressive advances toward my husband. David had documented everything with clinical precision. He noted the dates, the times, the locations, and the exact words she used. There was an entry from a family barbecue where she had cornered him in the kitchen and pressed herself against him while I was outside talking to our father. There was an entry detailing the late-night text messages she would send him complaining about her deadbeat boyfriend Kyle and explicitly suggesting that David needed a woman who was more adventurous. Another page documented the time she showed up at his downtown office unannounced, wearing a revealing dress and demanding he take her to an expensive lunch because she was having a bad day. Every single entry ended with the exact same outcome. David firmly rejecting her advances, telling her to stay away from him, and immediately coming home to report the incident to me. We had sat on our living room couch, countless times disgusted by her predatory behavior. We had tried to distance ourselves from her. We had even tried to bring it up to our mother once. Susan had immediately turned it around on me, accusing me of being insecure and jealous of Monica's natural charm. She told David he was simply misinterpreting my sister's friendly, outgoing personality. My parents had enabled her toxic behavior, gaslighting us to protect their golden child. But David had refused to be a victim of her manipulation. He had built a paper trail of her harassment. This journal proved that David despised Monica. It proved that he would never, under any circumstances, touch her. It established a clear, undeniable motive for her current actions. She was a scorned, desperate woman who had been rejected by the man she wanted, and now she was trying to use his death to steal his wealth. I set the leather journal down next to the will. Piece of evidence number 2. My hands moved back to the metal box for the third and final folder. This was the one that truly sealed my sister's fate. It was a sealed medical file from Massachusetts General Hospital. I pulled out the clinical reports, the laboratory results, and the surgical summaries. 2 years before Leo was even conceived, David had gone to the doctor, complaining of severe discomfort. The diagnosis was a varicocele, an enlargement of the veins within the scrotum that required immediate surgical intervention to relieve the pain. The procedure was complex, and during the consultations, the surgeon had strongly recommended a concurrent procedure. Given the extensive nature of the surgery and the high risk of future complications, the doctor advised David to undergo a vasectomy at the same time. David and I had spent days discussing it. We had made the difficult but necessary choice to prioritize his long-term health. The surgery was a complete success. The medical file in my hands contained the post-operative reports confirming that the vasectomy was irreversible and absolutely effective. It outlined the follow-up tests David took months later, proving his sperm count was absolute 0. It was a physical, biological impossibility for David to father a child. He was completely sterile 2 full years before Monica ever got pregnant with Leo. I stared at the stark black and white text of the medical report. The sheer magnitude of Monica's lie washed over me again. She had stood in her backyard, surrounded by our extended family, and looked me dead in the eye while claiming my husband was the father of her baby. She had subjected me to the ultimate humiliation, trying to brand my loyal, honorable husband as a cheating scumbag. She had rallied our parents to her side, watching with glee as my own mother and father ordered me to surrender my home to pay for her mistakes. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I would cower in the face of public shame and write them a massive check just to keep the peace. They had no idea that I was holding the biological equivalent of a nuclear bomb. This medical file did not just prove that Monica was lying. It proved that her entire extortion plot was fundamentally scientifically impossible. She had tied her financial salvation to a man who literally could not have given her the child she was parading around. I arranged the 3 documents side by side on the mahogany table. The ironclad will, the detailed harassment journal, the sterile medical file. Together they formed a flawless, impenetrable shield against my family's treachery. The grief that had been threatening to drown me all week was suddenly gone, entirely burned away by a cold, righteous fury. I was no longer a shattered widow trying to survive a children's birthday party. I was a wealthy, independent woman armed with undeniable truth, and I was about to unleash absolute hell on the people who thought they could destroy me. My parents had told me that family protects family. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you betray the only family member who actually has the power to destroy you. I gathered the documents, my movements precise and deliberate. I slid the medical records, the journal, and the real will into my leather tote bag, ensuring they were perfectly secure. I closed the heavy lid of the safe deposit box, engaged the dual brass latches, and locked it away. I did not need the metal box anymore. I had everything I needed right here in my bag. I walked out of the viewing room, handed the bank manager her key with a polite nod, and marched straight out the sliding glass doors into the bright afternoon sun. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my parents' missed calls and Monica's demanding text messages. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. I tapped the screen and dialed Harrison. He was the senior managing partner at David's law firm, a ruthless, cutthroat litigator who viewed David like a son and treated me like a daughter. He was the kind of man who destroyed opposing counsel for sport before his morning coffee. The line rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered. I did not bother with pleasantries. Harrison, I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. We have a massive problem, and it requires your immediate attention. The drive into downtown Boston was a blur of gray pavement and aggressive traffic, but my mind was laser-focused. I parked in the underground garage of Harrison's firm, a towering skyscraper of glass and steel that dominated the city skyline. Harrison was not just David's senior law partner. He was a ruthless, brilliant litigator who had mentored my husband since David was fresh out of law school. Over the past 10 years, Harrison and his wife had become like family to us. When David died, Harrison wept at the funeral with genuine, unbridled sorrow. I knew that if there was one person on this earth who would fiercely protect David's legacy, it was him. I bypassed the receptionist with a polite nod and walked straight down the plush-carpeted hallway to his corner office. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open to find Harrison standing by his floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the harbor. He turned as I entered, his sharp gray eyes instantly reading the tension vibrating through my body. He did not offer empty platitudes or ask how I was feeling. He simply gestured to the leather chairs opposite his massive desk and told me to sit down. I dropped my heavy tote bag onto the polished wood, the sound echoing in the quiet, imposing room. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and opened the photo gallery. When Monica had shoved that piece of paper into my hands at the birthday party, I had taken a quick, clear photograph of it before handing it back to her. I slid my phone across the desk toward Harrison. He picked it up, adjusting his reading glasses. His eyes scanned the glowing screen. For a moment, the room was absolutely silent. Then a low, harsh scoff escaped his chest. He shook his head, a mixture of profound disgust and professional amusement crossing his weathered face. He set the phone down and looked at me, his jaw clenched tight. This is what she presented to you. This is what she expects you to surrender your home over. I nodded, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap. She announced it in front of the entire neighborhood. She told everyone, David is the father of her son, and claimed this document proves he wanted the child to have half my house. Harrison let out a sharp, humorless laugh that held absolutely no warmth. He leaned forward, tapping a heavy gold pen against his desk pad. Joanna, the legal jargon on this piece of paper is a complete joke. It reads like someone typed final will and testament into a search engine, clicked on the very first free template they found, and filled in the blanks. The formatting is completely wrong for Massachusetts probate law. The witness lines are improperly structured and there is no notary seal. But beyond the embarrassing lack of legal structure, the signature itself is an absolute insult. I have seen David sign his name to thousands of contracts, briefs, and settlement agreements over the last decade. I know his signature as well as I know my own. Whoever forged this did not even bother to practice. They traced it, and they traced it poorly. The validation from a legal expert washed over me, solidifying the icy armor I had built since leaving the party. But Harrison was not finished. His expression turned lethal as he outlined the reality of my sister's actions. This is not just a cruel lie, Joanna. This is a severe, actionable felony. Forging a signature on a testamentary document with the explicit intent to extort property is a serious crime. She is using a fabricated legal document to demand a $300,000 asset. If she actually tries to present this in a court of law, a judge would laugh her right out of the room before handing her over to the district attorney. We could have her arrested today. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the actual documents I had retrieved from the bank vault. I am not going to the police just yet, I said, my voice steady and cold. I want to completely dismantle her. I want to tear down the entire narrative she and my parents are building. I slid the 3 pristine manila folders across his desk. I want you to look at these. Harrison opened the first folder. It contained David's real notarized will. He barely glanced at it, knowing its contents perfectly, because his own firm had drafted and executed it. But when he opened the second folder, his demeanor shifted entirely. I watched as he read the first few pages of David's handwritten journal. The color slowly drained from Harrison's face, replaced by a dark, simmering fury. David had documented every single time Monica had cornered him, every inappropriate text message she had sent, and every aggressive advance she had made over the years. Harrison read David's meticulous notes detailing how my sister had propositioned him, how he had rejected her, and how disgusted he was by her predatory behavior. "David never told me it was this bad," Harrison murmured, his voice thick with suppressed anger. "He mentioned once that your sister was difficult and lacked boundaries, but this is entirely different. This is a sustained, calculated campaign of harassment. He was trying to protect his marriage, and he was trying to protect you from your own family." To read these words, to see how much she tormented him while he maintained his honor, it makes my blood boil. He closed the journal gently, as if treating David's memory with the utmost reverence. Then he opened the third folder. The Massachusetts General Hospital logo was printed clearly across the top of the clinical reports. Harrison scanned the surgical summaries, the laboratory results, and the post-operative confirmations. His eyes widened as the biological reality of the situation clicked into place. He looked up at me, his gray eyes blazing with a mix of shock and predatory anticipation. "A vasectomy," Harrison stated, laying the paper flat on his desk. David underwent a successful, irreversible vasectomy 2 full years before this child was ever conceived. His sperm count was biologically 0. He tapped the paper, his mind moving a million miles a minute. "Joanna, this medical file is the ultimate trump card. It makes her entire claim biologically impossible. She has built an extortion plot around a child that David could not have fathered if he wanted to." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "My parents are backing her. My father threatened to go to the newspapers and tell everyone I am a greedy, barren widow hoarding wealth from a baby. They are fully complicit in this. They want me to sell the house and hand over the cash so they can bail out their precious golden child." Harrison stood up from his desk and began to pace the length of his office. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of his footsteps, but the energy radiating from him was electric. He was a man going to war. He paused by the window, looking out over the city as he pieced together the puzzle. "This is what puzzles me, Joanna. The sheer audacity of this crime is staggering. Monica is incredibly arrogant, yes, but arrogance alone does not explain this level of sheer, unadulterated stupidity. Forging a will is a massive risk. Threatening to smear a dead man's reputation to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from his widow is a massive risk." He turned to face me, leaning against the window frame. "People do not risk 5 years in a state prison for a forged will unless they are drowning. They do not risk total annihilation unless they are backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. Your sister is greedy and your parents are toxic enablers, but this plot reeks of pure blind desperation. We need to know what kind of fire is burning under your sister before we strike back. We need to know exactly what she is running from. If we understand her true motive, we can predict her next move, and we can lay a trap she will walk right into." I nodded, the logic of his words resonating deeply. I knew Monica was terrible with money. I knew Kyle, her ex-boyfriend, was a deadbeat who had vanished, but Harold and Susan had always managed to keep her head above water. There had to be something else, a massive looming catastrophe that she was trying to fix with my house money. "What do we do?" I asked, feeling the comforting weight of having a powerful ally in my corner. Harrison walked back to his massive mahogany desk and picked up his phone. He did not hesitate. He punched in a number he clearly knew by heart. "We find out exactly how deep her debt goes. We find out where the real father is, and we uncover every single skeleton she has desperately tried to bury." He held the phone to his ear, his eyes locked on mine with a promise of absolute destruction. When the line connected, his voice was all business, sharp and commanding. Frank, it is Harrison. I have a job for you and it needs to be priority one. I am sending over a name and an address. I want a complete microscopic financial and personal background check. I want credit card debts, eviction notices, personal loans, and the whereabouts of her ex-boyfriend. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. Dig up every single skeleton buried in her closet and have a full report on my desk in 3 days. Exactly 72 hours later, I sat in the very same leather chair in Harrison's corner office. The Boston skyline was obscured by heavy gray clouds, reflecting the grim reality of the situation we were about to dissect. Frank Delaney sat across from me. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick neck, a rumpled trench coat, and the weary eyes of a former detective who had spent decades looking at the ugliest parts of human nature. He held a thick manila envelope in his calloused hands. There were no pleasantries. Frank was a professional who dealt in facts, and the facts he had gathered over the past 3 days were absolutely devastating. He tossed the heavy folder onto Harrison's mahogany desk. It landed with a thick thud. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "Your sister is not just broke." Joanna Frank began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "She is in an absolute financial freefall. The kind of freefall that makes people do incredibly stupid, reckless things, like forging a dead man's signature on a legal document in front of 20 witnesses." I leaned forward, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. "Tell me everything," I said. Frank reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of financial statements, spreading them across the polished wood. Monica has always liked playing the part of the wealthy suburban mother. We pulled her credit reports and bank statements. She has completely maxed out 7 different high-yield credit cards in the past 18 months. The total balance is sitting right at $80,000. I stared at the numbers highlighted in yellow ink. $80,000. My mind raced back to the designer dress Monica was wearing at Leo's birthday party, the catered food, the expensive champagne she used to toast to my late husband's fabricated infidelity. She had built an entire life out of plastic cards and delusion. She was drowning in interest payments, purchasing luxury handbags and spa treatments, while her son wore brand-new boutique outfits she absolutely could not afford. My parents had always bailed her out of her minor debts, throwing a few $1,000s here and there to cover her rent or her car payments. They had always justified it by saying she just needed a little help getting on her feet. But this was not a little help. This was a catastrophic mountain of debt that my parents, who were already dipping into their retirement savings to support her lifestyle, simply could not cover. Frank tapped a thick finger against a particularly alarming document near the center of the desk. "And here is where the desperation really kicks in," he continued. "The credit card debt is bad, but the housing situation is immediate. She has not paid rent on that charming little house in 3 months. The landlord filed formal eviction papers last Thursday. She has exactly 10 days to vacate the premises before the sheriff's department physically removes her belongings and locks her out." Harrison let out a low whistle, leaning back in his leather chair. A forged will and a fake paternity claim. She thought she could force a quick settlement. She thought you would be so blinded by grief and public humiliation that you would instantly agree to sell your house and cut her a check for $300,000. It would be enough to pay off the $80,000 in credit card debt, secure a new luxury rental, and live comfortably for the next few years without ever having to get a real job. It all made sickening sense. Monica had timed her horrific announcement perfectly. She waited exactly 1 week after David's funeral, knowing I was at my absolute weakest. She orchestrated the public ambush at a birthday party, surrounded by gossiping neighbors and extended relatives, banking on my lifelong aversion to public drama. She assumed I would fold immediately just to make the whispered rumors stop. She viewed my tragedy not as a loss, but as a financial opportunity. "But what about Kyle?" I asked, tracing the edge of the eviction notice with my fingertip. "Our parents have been complaining for months that he is behind on his child support payments. Why is she not taking him to court to garnish his wages? He is Leo's biological father. He should be the one bailing her out of this mess, not me." Frank let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He pulled a separate thinner file from the envelope and slid it toward me. Kyle is effectively a ghost. 2 weeks ago, he quit his job at the local auto shop. He emptied his bank accounts, packed his truck, and crossed state lines. My contacts in the state police ran his plates. He is currently somewhere in rural Nevada living off the grid. He owes over $15,000 in back child support, and he knows the state was about to suspend his driver's license and throw him in jail. He ran, and he is never coming back. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Kyle fleeing the state was the match that lit the powder keg. Monica had lost her only source of consistent income. Her credit cards were declined. Her landlord was threatening to throw her out on the street. She was cornered. Instead of looking for a job or taking responsibility for her catastrophic financial mismanagement, she looked around for the easiest target to exploit. She saw her grieving sister sitting in a completely paid-off $600,000 home. She saw a dead man who could not defend himself against false allegations. She saw a golden ticket. I sat back in my chair staring at the physical evidence of my sister's spectacular failure. The sheer audacity of her plan was breathtaking. She was willing to completely destroy my memory of David. She was willing to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. She was willing to commit a state felony, all because she refused to live within her means and wanted me to foot the bill for her luxurious delusions. And my parents, my own mother and father, had eagerly jumped on board her sinking ship, willing to throw me overboard just to keep their golden child afloat. "We have everything we need," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He gathered the financial documents, the eviction notices, and the background checks, placing them neatly back into the manila folder. "We have the proof that her document is a blatant forgery. We have David's medical records proving a biological impossibility. We have his journal outlining a clear history of predatory harassment. And now, thanks to Frank, we have the exact motive for her crime. Pure, unadulterated financial desperation." Harrison looked directly at me, his gray eyes piercing. "The question is, Joanna, how do you want to play this? We can hand this entire file over to the district attorney right now. The fraud division will have a warrant out for her arrest before dinner. She will be sitting in a holding cell tonight facing multiple felony charges for forgery and attempted extortion." I looked down at my hands. A part of me, the part that was still bleeding from the loss of my husband, wanted to watch the police slap handcuffs on her wrists. I wanted to see the smug, triumphant smile wiped completely off her face. But an immediate arrest was too clean. It was too fast. If she went to jail today, she would play the victim. She would spin a narrative that the wealthy, cruel sister had used expensive lawyers to bully a poor, struggling single mother. My parents would mortgage whatever they had left to bail her out, painting me as a monster to the rest of the family. "No," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I do not want to go to the police today. I want to draw this out. I want them to think they are winning. They ambushed me in public because they thought I was weak. I want to corner them in a way they can never ever escape from. I want my parents to realize exactly what they have enabled, and I want Monica to understand that her actions have absolute, inescapable consequences." Harrison smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "I taught David everything he knew about litigation, and he always said you were the sharper tactician in the family. Tell me exactly what you want to do." I began to outline my plan, a strategy designed not just to defend my home, but to completely dismantle their extortion plot in front of the very people they were trying to impress. I would use their greed against them. I would dangle the money right in front of their faces, letting them believe their cruel manipulation had worked perfectly. I would invite them into my home, let them gloat, let them demand their payday, and then I would spring a trap so tight, so legally and socially binding, that they would never be able to show their faces in this city again. Frank nodded in approval, gathering his coat. "You are going to need audio recordings," he advised, his tone shifting into tactical mode. "Massachusetts is a two-party consent state for recording conversations, but there are legal loopholes when a crime is actively being committed in your own home. If she attempts to extort you, if she threatens you for cash, you need that captured on tape. It will turn a simple forgery case into a slam-dunk extortion felony." I will handle the legal parameters of the recordings, Harrison interjected, making a note on his legal pad. I can secure a private investigator with specialized audio equipment to wire your living room. We will ensure every word she says is captured with crystal clear clarity, making it fully admissible when we finally hand the package over to the authorities. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of power returning to my bones. For the first time since David's funeral, I felt like I was back in control. They thought they had broken me, but they had simply awakened a dormant, ruthless survival instinct. We would set up the house. We would invite Monica over for a formal negotiation. We would let her dig her own grave with her own words. But just as Frank finished his sentence, the silence in the office was shattered by a sharp, aggressive buzzing. My cell phone, resting on the corner of Harrison's desk, lit up with a notification. Then another, and another. The screen began to flash rapidly, a relentless stream of alerts lighting up the glass. I reached out and picked up the device. The notifications were pouring in from Facebook, from local community groups, from text messages sent by distant cousins and neighborhood acquaintances. My stomach plummeted as I read the preview text flashing across the locked screen. The words greedy, barren, and selfish jumped out at me in rapid succession. I unlocked the phone and opened the social media application. Monica, realizing that I had not immediately caved to her demands and handed over the deed to my house at the birthday party, had decided to escalate her attack. She was not waiting for me to make the next move. She had launched a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign across the internet, and she was dragging my dead husband's name right through the dirt. My thumb hovered over the glowing glass of my phone. I clicked the notification, and the application launched instantly, loading a web page that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a GoFundMe campaign jointly organized by my mother Susan and my sister Monica. The header image was a masterclass in emotional manipulation and theatrical deceit. It featured a candid, softly lit photograph of Monica sitting on a neighborhood park bench. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup as she clutched little Leo tightly to her chest. The child looked appropriately confused, staring into the camera lens with wide, innocent eyes. Below the photograph, a bold, sensational headline screamed for the internet's attention: "Help a secret orphan keep his rightful home." I read the campaign description, my pulse pounding, a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs. Monica had poured every ounce of her toxic creativity into a fabricated narrative of absolute tragedy. She wrote a sprawling, emotionally manipulative essay claiming that David, my late husband, had fathered her child in a tragic, star-crossed secret affair and had desperately wanted to provide for the boy. She claimed that upon his sudden tragic passing, I had discovered the shocking truth and retaliated with unimaginable cruelty. The text explicitly painted me as a greedy, barren widow who was hoarding David's wealth out of pure, unadulterated spite. She wrote that I was legally hoarding stolen assets, refusing to honor a dying man's final wishes, and purposefully leaving his secret biological child homeless and completely destitute. The sheer volume of lies was staggering to comprehend. The campaign goal was set to $300,000. That was the exact amount of equity tied up in my house. That was the exact amount Monica needed to clear her catastrophic $80,000 credit card debt and secure a new luxury rental property after her impending eviction. They were crowdsourcing their felony extortion plot. I slowly scrolled down the page, watching the digital numbers climb higher and higher. The campaign had only been live for 3 short hours, but it was already gaining massive, unstoppable traction within our local community. My parents had weaponized their entire social network to destroy my life. They had shared the fraudulent link across multiple neighborhood groups, church message boards, and local community pages. I clicked on the comments section, bracing myself for the inevitable impact. It was a digital firing squad. Harold's country club friends, men who had shaken David's hand, drank his expensive scotch, and pretended to be his friend, were leaving lengthy paragraphs condemning my character. They demanded I do the right thing and honor a dead man's legacy. Extended relatives, aunts and cousins who had attended our wedding and eaten at our dinner table were actively rallying behind Monica. Aunt Martha wrote that she always knew I was too cold and selfish to understand the true meaning of family loyalty. Cousin Greg posted a furious profanity-laced rant about how wealth corrupts people, demanding I hand over the deed to the house immediately to prevent a helpless baby from sleeping on the freezing streets. Nosy neighbors who only knew me from passing waves on the sidewalk were enthusiastically chiming in, calling for a total boycott of any business associated with me. They were absolutely feasting on the drama, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were being used as gullible pawns in a desperate criminal extortion scheme. The sheer speed at which my own flesh and blood had turned on me was breathtaking. They had not asked for my side of the story. They had not asked for a single shred of proof. They had simply consumed the lie because it was wrapped in the intoxicating, irresistible packaging of a public scandal. I watched the donation counter tick upward. $50 here, $100 there. Every donation was accompanied by a venomous message directed squarely at me, attacking my marriage, my character, and my grief. But the nightmare did not stop there. Another notification slid down from the top of my phone screen, this one from my professional corporate email account. Then a third, then a fourth. My heart hammered wildly against my sternum as I opened the inbox. The notifications were automated priority alerts from Google Business and Yelp. My blood ran completely cold. I am a senior wealth manager at a prominent downtown financial firm. My entire career is built on a solid foundation of absolute trust, impeccable ethics, and flawless public perception. Clients trust me to manage their life savings, their retirement portfolios, and their children's college funds. Reputation is absolutely everything in my competitive industry. Monica and Susan knew this perfectly well. They knew that if they simply attacked my personal life on Facebook, I might just ignore them and ride out the storm, so they had deliberately decided to go after my livelihood. I clicked the direct link to my professional profile page. A massive wave of toxic one-star reviews had flooded the page within the last hour. The reviews were devastating, explicitly accusing me of financial cruelty and hoarding stolen assets. One review, posted under a painfully obvious fake name, warned potential clients that I was a ruthless, heartless manipulator who stole from orphans and hoarded family money. Another review claimed I had illegally seized residential real estate from a helpless single mother and advised everyone to pull their investments from my firm immediately. They were using the exact same buzzwords from the fraudulent GoFundMe campaign, perfectly coordinating the language to maximize the search engine damage. They were actively trying to completely destroy my career to force my hand. They believed that if the senior partners at my firm saw these horrible reviews, I would be fired on the spot. They assumed that the terrifying threat of professional ruin would compel me to instantly transfer the deed of the house to Monica, just to make the nightmare stop. The sheer scale of the sabotage was almost impressive in its malice. Monica was a drowning woman pulling everyone down into the abyss with her, and my parents were eagerly handing her the heavy iron anchors. I placed the phone flat on the center of the mahogany desk and pushed it toward Harrison. He adjusted his suit jacket, leaned forward, and picked up the device. I watched his eyes track back and forth as he read the GoFundMe description. I watched his jaw tighten as he scrolled through the barrage of hateful comments from my extended family. I watched his knuckles turn white as he switched over to my professional business profile and saw the coordinated attack on my career. Frank stood quietly by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, observing the silent exchange. The air in the office grew incredibly heavy, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a violent storm. Harrison slowly placed the phone back on the desk. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. His anger was far too profound for noise. He looked at me with a cold, terrifying intensity that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "We are shutting this down right now," Harrison stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He reached for his desk phone. "I am drafting an immediate cease and desist order. I am contacting the legal department at GoFundMe to have that fraudulent page ripped off the internet for violating their terms of service regarding criminal extortion." Then I am calling my contacts at Google and Yelp to have those defamatory reviews scrubbed from your professional profile. We are filing a massive civil suit for defamation of character libel and tortious interference with your business. We will drag your sister and your parents into a courtroom and bleed them absolutely dry before we hand them over to the district attorney for the forgery and extortion charges. They want to play games with your livelihood. We will destroy theirs. He picked up the receiver, his fingers hovering over the keypad. Wait, I said. The single word cut through the heavy air of the office. Harrison paused, the phone still held to his ear. He looked at me, his gray eyes narrowing in confusion. Frank shifted by the window, his gaze locking onto my face. Put the phone down, Harrison, I said, my voice steady and surprisingly calm. I reached across the desk and pulled my cell phone back toward me. Joanna, you cannot let this stand. Harrison warned, his tone sharp with concern. They are actively destroying your professional reputation. Every minute those reviews stay up, it damages your career. Every minute that campaign is live, they are collecting money under false pretenses. You need to crush this instantly. I am not fighting them online, I explained calmly. If we send a cease and desist right now, Monica will panic. She will know we have lawyers, and she will immediately destroy the evidence. She will delete the page and claim she was hacked. I want her to feel victorious. I want her to believe her smear campaign worked flawlessly. I unlocked my phone and opened my messages. I scrolled down to Monica's name. I tapped the reply box, my thumbs hovering over the digital keyboard. I typed the exact words of absolute defeat. You win. I can't handle the public hate. Come over to the house tomorrow. Let's discuss transferring the deed. I stared at the message. I did not hesitate for a second. I pressed the send button. I looked up at Harrison. The trap is officially set. The heavy manila folder glided smoothly over the polished glass, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch from Monica's steaming latte. The stark white label of Massachusetts General Hospital was clearly visible, stamped with the bold red ink of a certified medical records department. Monica paused, her coffee mug hovering halfway to her mouth. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together in genuine confusion. She looked from the folder to my face, expecting to see the terrified, compliant sister she had walked in to dominate. Instead, she found me sitting perfectly upright, my shoulders squared, my eyes locked onto hers with the cold, unblinking intensity of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a snare. "What is this? Joanna, Monica?" asked, her voice laced with an impatient, condescending edge. She set her mug down on the saucer with a sharp clink. "I told you I want the property transfer paperwork. I don't have time to review your old household bills or whatever this is." I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the blazing fury that had kept me awake for the last 72 hours. I spoke with the icy clinical precision of an executioner reading a final sentence. "That is the absolute truth, Monica." I said, the words echoing clearly in the quiet living room, perfectly captured by the hidden recorders beneath us. "That is a certified sealed medical file containing my late husband's surgical records, laboratory results, and post-operative evaluations." Monica's arrogant smirk faltered slightly. Her eyes darted down to the folder, a flicker of apprehension finally breaking through her impenetrable facade. "Medical records? What are you talking about? Why are you handing me David's medical records?" "Because, Monica," I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "2 years before you ever got pregnant with Leo, David was diagnosed with a severe varicocele. The pain was debilitating, and the surgical intervention required to fix it was extensive. During that procedure, at the strict recommendation of his surgical team, David underwent a complete irreversible vasectomy. The silence that followed was absolute. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and lethal. I watched as the color drained from Monica's face in a rapid, terrifying rush. Her perfectly applied blush suddenly stood out in stark, clownish relief against her chalk-white skin. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes remained glued to the manila folder, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. I leaned back in my armchair, watching the catastrophic reality of her situation crash down upon her. The post-operative tests confirmed that the procedure was entirely successful, I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of her extortion plot. His sperm count was biologically zero. He was completely medically sterile 24 months before your son was even conceived. It is scientifically impossible for David to be Leo's father. Monica's hands began to tremble. She reached out and snatched the folder off the glass table, her fingers fumbling blindly with the clasp. She ripped the cover open and stared at the clinical reports. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the medical jargon, searching desperately for a loophole. A mistake, anything to salvage the lie she had built her entire future upon. But there was nothing. The documents were absolute. The surgeon's signature was bold and unyielding. "This is fake!" Monica gasped, her voice suddenly thin and reedy. She threw the folder back onto the table, the papers spilling out across the glass. "You forged this. You made this up because you don't want to share the house. You're lying." I shook my head slowly, a grim, humorless smile finally touching my lips. "No, Monica. You are the one who forges documents. You are the one who downloads generic templates from the internet and traces a dead man's signature to steal a $300,000 asset. These are certified records from Massachusetts General. The attending surgeon is ready to testify in open court. The hospital administration has already authenticated the file for my attorney." "You have an attorney?" Monica choked out her panic, instantly escalating into raw terror. She scrambled backward on the velvet sofa, her confidence entirely shattered. "I have Harrison," I replied, uttering the name of David's ruthless senior partner like a loaded weapon. "And I have Frank Delaney, a private investigator, who has spent the last 3 days conducting a microscopic forensic audit of your entire miserable existence." Monica froze, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. She looked frantically toward the front door, the instinct to flee suddenly overpowering her greed. But I was not finished. The trap had been sprung, and I was going to ensure it locked tight around her neck. Frank was incredibly thorough. I continued, my voice echoing clearly for the hidden microphones. "He found the $80,000 in high-yield credit card debt you've racked up trying to play the part of the wealthy suburban socialite. He found the formal eviction notice your landlord filed last Thursday because you haven't paid rent in 3 months. And most importantly, he found Kyle." Monica gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air that sounded like she was suffocating. "Kyle didn't just walk out on you," I said, leaning forward to ensure she heard every single word. "Kyle quit his job at the auto shop, emptied his bank accounts, and fled to rural Nevada to dodge a $15,000 backlog of child support. You lost your only source of income, your credit cards are maxed out, and you have exactly 10 days before the sheriff throws you and Leo out onto the street. You are drowning in debt, Monica, so you decided to forge a legal document, invent a disgusting lie about my dead husband, and extort me for the equity in this house just to save yourself." "You can't prove any of that!" Monica shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. She leaped up from the sofa, her hands balled into tight fists. She was pacing the living room floor, her carefully constructed reality collapsing in real time. "If you go to the police, I'll tell everyone you're making this up. Mom and Dad will back me. They know David wanted to provide for Leo. They'll tell the judge you're a liar." I remained seated, watching her panic spiral into absolute madness. "My parents will not be able to back your story, Monica, because they are going to be too busy trying to keep themselves out of federal prison for conspiracy to commit extortion." I reached back into my tote bag and pulled out the dark leather-bound journal. I set it gently on top of the spilled medical records. I tapped the cover with my index finger. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This is a diary David started keeping 2 years ago at the strict advice of his law firm. He documented every single time you harassed him, every time you cornered him at family barbecues, every disgusting predatory text message you sent him late at night, complaining about Kyle and throwing yourself at him. He documented how much you sickened him, Monica. He documented his absolute refusal to ever touch you. Monica stared at the journal, the last remnants of her defiance draining away. She looked physically ill, her chest heaving as the walls closed in around her. "We have the forged will," I stated, ticking the items off on my fingers. "We have the medical impossibility. We have the documented history of your harassment. We have the exact financial motive for your extortion. And as of right now, we have your entire panicked reaction recorded with crystal clarity." I gestured casually to the space beneath the glass coffee table and then toward the oak bookshelf. "Massachusetts is a two-party consent state for recording conversations," Monica, I explained, repeating Harrison's legal counsel verbatim. "But there is a beautiful legal loophole. When a felony extortion plot is actively being committed inside someone's private residence, the homeowner has the absolute right to record the crime in progress. Every threat you just made, every admission of your financial ruin, every detail of your plan to tear down my kitchen walls with stolen money, it is all perfectly captured on high-grade digital audio." Monica staggered backward, her high heels catching on the edge of the silk rug. She looked utterly destroyed, a cornered animal realizing there was absolutely no escape. She dropped her expensive red handbag, the leather slapping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Please, Joanna," she sobbed, and this time the tears streaming down her face were completely genuine. The arrogant monster had vanished, replaced by a terrified, broken woman, staring down the barrel of a multi-year prison sentence. "Please don't do this. I'll go to jail. They'll take Leo away from me. I was just so scared. I didn't know how to pay the bills. Mom and Dad said you had enough money to spare. They said you wouldn't fight back. Please, you're my sister." I stood up slowly, drawing myself to my full height. I looked down at the woman who had tried to destroy my life, my reputation, and my husband's honorable memory, all for a quick payday. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sisterly bond. The woman standing before me was a stranger, a parasite who had finally been severed from her host. "You lost the right to call me your sister the second you forged my dead husband's name," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "You have 24 hours, Monica. You have exactly 24 hours to log on to that GoFundMe page, issue a public statement admitting that you lied about the paternity, and refund every single penny you collected. You will publicly retract every single defamatory review you posted on my business page. You will tell our parents exactly what you did, and you will pack your bags and leave this state." Monica wept openly, her hands covering her face, as she nodded frantically, completely broken and entirely at my mercy. "If you do not comply by noon tomorrow," I continued, showing no mercy, "Harrison will hand this entire file to the district attorney. You will be arrested for forgery, fraud, and felony extortion. You will go to prison, and I will personally ensure you never see a dime of our family's money ever again." I pointed a steady finger toward the front door. "Now get out of my house." My thumb hovered over the glowing glass of my phone, trembling slightly as the barrage of notifications continued to ping. I clicked the top alert, and the social media application launched, instantly loading a web page that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. It was a GoFundMe campaign jointly organized by my mother Susan and my sister Monica. The header image was a masterclass in emotional manipulation and theatrical deceit. It featured a candid, softly lit photograph of Monica sitting on a neighborhood park bench. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup as she clutched little Leo tightly to her chest, wrapped in a faded, frayed blanket to emphasize their supposed poverty. The child looked appropriately confused, staring into the camera lens with wide, innocent eyes that seemed to beg the viewer for salvation. Below the photograph, a bold, sensational headline screamed for the internet to pay attention. "Help a secret orphan. Keep his rightful home." I read the campaign description, my pulse pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs. Monica had poured every ounce of her toxic creativity into a fabricated narrative of absolute tragedy. She wrote a sprawling, emotionally manipulative essay claiming that David, my late husband, had fathered her child in a tragic star-crossed secret affair and had desperately wanted to provide for the boy. She claimed that upon his sudden tragic passing, I had discovered the shocking truth and retaliated with unimaginable cruelty. The text explicitly painted me as a greedy barren widow who was hoarding David's wealth out of pure, unadulterated spite. She wrote that I was legally hoarding stolen assets, refusing to honor a dying man's final wishes, and purposefully leaving his secret biological child homeless and completely destitute. The sheer volume of lies was staggering to comprehend. The campaign goal was set to $300,000. That was the exact amount of equity tied up in my house. That was the exact amount Monica needed to clear her catastrophic $80,000 credit card debt, pay off her impending legal fees, and secure a new luxury rental property after her impending eviction. They were crowdsourcing their felony extortion plot in broad daylight, using the inherent goodness and charity of our local community to fund a criminal enterprise. I slowly scrolled down the page, watching the digital numbers climb higher and higher. The campaign had only been live for 3 short hours, but it was already gaining massive, unstoppable traction within our local community. My parents had weaponized their entire social network to destroy my life. They had shared the fraudulent link across multiple neighborhood groups, church message boards, and local community pages. I clicked on the comments section, bracing myself for the inevitable impact. It was a digital firing squad. Harold's country club friends, men who had shaken David's hand, drank his expensive scotch, and pretended to be his friend, were leaving lengthy paragraphs condemning my character. They demanded I do the right thing and honor a dead man's legacy. Extended relatives, aunts and cousins who had attended our wedding and eaten at our dinner table, were actively rallying behind Monica. Aunt Martha wrote that she always knew I was too cold and selfish to understand the true meaning of family loyalty, claiming that my refusal to embrace Leo was a direct insult to the sanctity of motherhood. Cousin Greg posted a furious profanity-laced rant about how wealth corrupts people, demanding I hand over the deed to the house immediately to prevent a helpless baby from sleeping on the freezing streets of Boston. He even tagged the local news stations in his comment, urging them to investigate my appalling behavior. Nosy neighbors who only knew me from passing waves on the sidewalk were enthusiastically chiming in, calling for a total boycott of any business associated with me. They were absolutely feasting on the drama, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were being used as gullible pawns in a desperate criminal extortion scheme. The sheer speed at which my own flesh and blood had turned on me was breathtaking. They had not asked for my side of the story. They had not asked for a single shred of proof. They had simply consumed the lie because it was wrapped in the intoxicating, irresistible packaging of a public scandal. I watched the donation counter tick upward, $50 here, $100 there. Every donation was accompanied by a venomous message directed squarely at me, attacking my marriage, my character, and my grief. But the nightmare did not stop there. Another notification slid down from the top of my phone screen, this one from my professional corporate email account. Then a third, then a fourth. My heart hammered wildly against my sternum as I opened the inbox. The notifications were automated priority alerts from Google Business and Yelp. My blood ran completely cold. I am a senior wealth manager at a prominent downtown financial firm. My entire career is built on a solid foundation of absolute trust, impeccable ethics, and flawless public perception. Clients trust me to manage their life savings, their retirement portfolios, their corporate trusts, and their children's college funds. Reputation is absolutely everything in my competitive industry. A single whisper of financial impropriety or ethical misconduct can send clients running to rival firms. Monica and Susan knew this perfectly well. They knew that if they simply attacked my personal life on Facebook, I might just ignore them and ride out the storm. So they had deliberately decided to go after my livelihood. I clicked the direct link to my professional profile page. A massive wave of toxic one-star reviews had flooded the page within the last hour. The reviews were devastating, explicitly accusing me of financial cruelty and hoarding stolen assets. One review, posted under a painfully obvious fake name, warned potential clients that I was a ruthless, heartless manipulator who stole from orphans and hoarded family money. Another review claimed I had illegally seized residential real estate from a helpless single mother and advised everyone to pull their investments from my firm immediately, stating that anyone who would rob an orphan would not hesitate to embezzle from their own clients. They were using the exact same buzzwords from the fraudulent GoFundMe campaign, perfectly coordinating the language to maximize the search engine damage. They were actively trying to completely destroy my career, to force my hand. They believed that if the senior partners at my firm saw these horrible reviews, I would be fired on the spot. They assumed that the terrifying threat of professional ruin would compel me to instantly transfer the deed of the house to Monica just to make the nightmare stop. The sheer scale of the sabotage was almost impressive in its malice. Monica was a drowning woman pulling everyone down into the abyss with her, and my parents were eagerly handing her the heavy iron anchors. I sat completely frozen in the leather chair, the glow of the phone screen illuminating the sheer devastation of my personal and professional life. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could ever manage. These were people who had eaten food from my table, people who had sent me sympathy cards when David died, people who shared my genetic material. They had not paused for a single moment to question the validity of Monica's claims. They had eagerly sharpened their pitchforks and lit their torches, thrilled by the opportunity to drag a successful woman down from her pedestal. The isolation was absolute and terrifying. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I felt the overwhelming urge to surrender, to give them exactly what they wanted, just to silence the deafening roar of public hatred. I could sell the house, pay Monica her ransom, and disappear to another city where no one knew my name or my dead husband's fabricated sins. But then the grief shifted, hardening into something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. I was not going to run. I was not going to let a manipulative liar and her enabling parents destroy the honorable legacy David and I had built together. I placed the phone flat on the center of the mahogany desk and pushed it toward Harrison. He adjusted his suit jacket, leaned forward, and picked up the device. I watched his eyes track back and forth as he read the GoFundMe description. I watched his jaw tighten as he scrolled through the barrage of hateful comments from my extended family. I watched his knuckles turn white as he switched over to my professional business profile and saw the coordinated attack on my career. Frank stood quietly by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, observing the silent exchange. The air in the office grew incredibly heavy, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a violent storm. Harrison slowly placed the phone back on the desk. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. His anger was far too profound for noise. He looked at me with a cold, terrifying intensity that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "We are shutting this down right now," Harrison stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He reached for his desk phone. "I am drafting an immediate cease and desist order. I am contacting the legal department at GoFundMe to have that fraudulent page ripped off the internet for violating their terms of service regarding criminal extortion. Then I am calling my contacts at Google and Yelp to have those defamatory reviews scrubbed from your professional profile. We are filing a massive civil suit for defamation of character, libel, and tortious interference with your business. We will drag your sister and your parents into a courtroom and bleed them absolutely dry before we hand them over to the district attorney for the forgery and extortion charges. They want to play games with your livelihood. We will destroy theirs." He picked up the receiver, his fingers hovering over the keypad. "Wait," I said. The single word cut through the heavy air of the office. Harrison paused, the phone still held to his ear. He looked at me, his gray eyes narrowing in confusion. Frank shifted by the window, his gaze locking onto my face. "Put the phone down, Harrison," I said, my voice steady and surprisingly calm. I reached across the desk and pulled my cell phone back toward me. "Joanna, you cannot let this stand," Harrison warned, his tone sharp with concern. "They are actively destroying your professional reputation. Every minute those reviews stay up, it damages your career. Every minute that campaign is live, they are collecting money under false pretenses. You need to crush this instantly before it spirals completely out of control." I am not fighting them online, I explained calmly. If we send a cease and desist right now, Monica will panic. She will know we have lawyers, and she will immediately destroy the evidence. She will delete the page and claim she was hacked. I want her to feel victorious. I want her to believe her smear campaign worked flawlessly. I want her to walk directly into the trap without a single shred of hesitation. I unlocked my phone and opened my messages. I scrolled down to Monica's name, viewing the last text she had sent me. I tapped the reply box, my thumbs hovering over the digital keyboard. I typed the exact words of absolute unconditional defeat, the kind of message a broken, terrified woman would send when she had entirely given up the fight. You win. I can't handle the public hate. Come over to the house tomorrow. Let's discuss transferring the deed. I stared at the message. I did not hesitate for a second. I pressed the send button. I looked up at Harrison. The trap is officially set. The sharp metallic jingle of keys echoed through the front hallway, followed by the heavy thud of the solid oak door swinging open. Heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. Harold and Susan. My parents marched into the living room with the arrogant familiarity of people who believed they owned every space they entered. They had used the spare emergency key I gave them years ago for a completely different kind of crisis. They had let themselves in to monitor the ongoing negotiations, eager to ensure their golden child secured her payday. Monica immediately spun around. Her face was still flushed from her own venomous outburst, but she instantly straightened her posture, looking at our parents for backup. I remained perfectly still on the sofa. For one brief, foolish second, a tiny ember of hope flared in my chest. These were the people who raised me. These were the people who had sat in the front row at my wedding and cried when I exchanged vows with David. I mistakenly believed that witnessing their youngest daughter attempt a felony extortion plot would finally snap them back to reality. Mom, Dad, I said, my voice tight with a mixture of shock and lingering grief. Tell me you heard what she just said. Tell me you heard her threaten to go to the local news. My father did not look at me. Harold stepped forward, his eyes landing directly on the scattered medical records resting on the glass coffee table. He reached down and picked up the certified file from Massachusetts General Hospital. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as his eyes scanned the clinical language, the surgical dates, and the undeniable biological proof of David's permanent sterility. I watched my father's face intently, waiting for the shock, waiting for the outrage, waiting for him to turn on Monica and demand an explanation for her horrific lies. Instead, Harold finished reading the surgeon's notes, closed the folder, and casually tossed it back onto the table. It landed with a soft, dismissive slap. He looked at me, his expression entirely devoid of emotion, and simply shrugged his shoulders. So what if he isn't the father? Harold stated, his voice flat and unapologetic. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. I stared at him, completely unable to process the profound cruelty of his statement. What did you just say? I whispered, my hands gripping the edge of the sofa cushions. Harold crossed his arms over his chest, adopting the same clinical negotiating posture he used when dealing with difficult contractors at his job. I said, so what? The biological details do not change the fundamental reality of the situation, Joanna. You are sitting on $600,000 in pure equity in this house. You have a massive investment portfolio and a lucrative career. Your sister is drowning. She is facing immediate eviction. She has a mountain of credit card debt and a child to raise alone. If transferring half the value of this property is what it takes to save her, then that is exactly what you are going to do. I shook my head, my mind rejecting the sheer audacity of his logic. She forged a legal document, Dad. She invented a lie about David having an affair. She just threatened to go to the local press and falsely accuse my dead husband of being a predator unless I hand her $300,000 in cash. That is a state felony. It is extortion. If you do not pay her, we will personally back up her story to the press, Harold replied, without a single second of hesitation. The room started to spin. The floor beneath me felt like it was dropping away into a bottomless black void. My own father was looking me directly in the eyes, casually threatening to participate in the complete destruction of my dead husband's reputation. He was willing to stand in front of television cameras and lie to the entire city, confirming Monica's fabricated abuse allegations, all to secure a financial bailout for his favorite daughter. Susan stepped out from behind my father. My mother looked at me with cold, hard eyes that held absolutely no maternal warmth. She smoothed down the front of her expensive blouse, her face a mask of bitter resentment. "You owe us this, Joanna," Susan said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "We raised you. We paid for your braces. We paid for your piano lessons. We paid for your college applications. You have lived a life of absolute privilege and luxury, while your sister has struggled for every single thing she has ever had. David is dead. His reputation does not matter anymore. He cannot feel anything. But Monica is alive. Leo is alive, and they need that money right now. You are going to write that check, and you are going to do it without another word of complaint, or we will make sure you never show your face in this town again." The parental betrayal was absolute. It was total and irreversible. In that single defining moment, the illusion of my family completely shattered. They did not care about David. They did not care about my grief. They did not care about the law or morality or the truth. They only cared about protecting Monica from the consequences of her own disastrous life choices. They were perfectly willing to throw me into a roaring fire just to keep their golden child warm. Monica stood beside them, a triumphant, wicked smile slowly spreading across her face. She crossed her arms, flanked by her enablers, basking in the glow of their unconditional, toxic support. She had won. She had weaponized our parents perfectly, turning my own flesh and blood into the ultimate instruments of her extortion. I sat on the sofa, absorbing the crushing weight of their collective betrayal. I felt the cold, hard plastic of the hidden voice recorders taped securely beneath the coffee table and behind the bookshelf. They had captured every single word. They had captured Harold's explicit threat to corroborate false allegations to the press. They had captured Susan's demand for a financial payoff. They had captured the entire undeniable conspiracy to commit felony extortion. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to let them win the battle so I could entirely annihilate them in the war. I slumped forward, letting my shoulders drop in a posture of total miserable defeat. I buried my face in my hands, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I forced my body to tremble, simulating the physical signs of a complete emotional breakdown. I let out a loud, ragged sob, dragging my fingers through my hair as if the pressure had finally fractured my mind. "Okay," I cried, my voice muffled behind my palms. I forced myself to sound weak, exhausted, and utterly broken. "Okay. You win. I cannot fight all of you. I cannot let you drag David's name through the mud on local television. I will pay her. I will give you the $300,000. I heard a sharp collective exhale from the three of them. The tension in the room instantly vanished, replaced by an intoxicating wave of greedy relief. I peeked through my fingers and saw Monica grinning from ear to ear. Susan reached out and patted Monica on the shoulder, a gesture of maternal triumph. Harold uncrossed his arms, nodding in grim satisfaction. "That is a very smart decision," Joanna, Harold said, his tone shifting back to paternal condescension. "It is the right thing to do for family." I slowly lowered my hands, making sure my expression remained hollow and defeated. "But I am not doing this with a simple bank transfer," I said, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. "If I am giving up half the value of my home, if I am liquidating my assets to pay you off, it has to be done legally. I am not going to hand over a check and risk you coming back for more next year." "What are you talking about?" Monica snapped, her eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "Just wire the money to my account." "No," I insisted, shaking my head stubbornly. "I am protecting myself. We are going to do this the right way. We are going to hold a formal estate execution dinner. I will invite David's senior law partners to the house. They will draft a binding, ironclad settlement agreement. You will sign a non-disclosure contract preventing you from ever speaking about David to the press. And in exchange, the lawyers will authorize the immediate release of $300,000 directly from the estate trust." I looked directly at my father, knowing exactly how his corporate mind worked. "You want the money guaranteed, Dad?" I said, playing to his practical greed. You want it clean, untaxed, and legally bulletproof so the IRS does not freeze Monica's accounts the second a massive cash deposit drops. The lawyers will structure it as an official estate disbursement, but it has to be done formally in person with all parties present to sign the final deeds. Harold considered this for a moment. I could see the greed calculating behind his eyes. He recognized the financial logic of avoiding a massive tax audit. He nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the structural safety of the plan. "She is right," Monica Harold said, turning to my sister. "A formal estate disbursement protects the cash. You get the money tax-free, and the non-disclosure agreement guarantees Joanna her peace of mind. It is a clean transaction." Monica looked at me, her eyes gleaming with undisguised avarice. She was already mentally spending the money. She was already visualizing the luxury apartment, the designer clothes, the absolute freedom from her crippling debt. Blinded completely by their perceived victory, none of them saw the lethal steel jaws of the trap waiting in the shadows. Fine, Monica agreed, lifting her chin with arrogant entitlement. "An estate execution dinner." "When?" "This Friday," I replied, keeping my voice low and submissive. "8 o'clock in the evening. I will have the catering arranged. The lawyers will bring the finalized documents and the certified bank drafts. You just need to show up, eat, sign the papers, and take your money." "We will be there," Susan announced, stepping forward to take control of the victory. "And I expect you to be gracious about this, Joanna. Your sister has been through enough trauma." "I will be perfectly prepared," I promised, looking straight into my mother's eyes. Without another word, the three of them turned and walked toward the front hallway. I sat in silence, listening to the heavy thud of the front door closing behind them, followed by the muffled sound of Harold's car engine starting in the driveway. They were leaving to celebrate. They were leaving to toast their successful manipulation and their impending financial windfall. I waited until the sound of their car completely faded down the street. Then I sat up straight, the posture of a defeated widow vanishing into thin air. I reached under the glass coffee table and peeled the small digital voice recorder from the wooden frame. I reached behind the heavy oak bookshelf and retrieved the second backup device. I pressed the stop button, securing the audio files containing every single threat, every admission of forgery, and every vile extortion demand. The false surrender had worked flawlessly. They had swallowed the bait whole. They were going to walk into my house on Friday night, expecting a luxurious dinner and a massive payday. Instead, they were going to walk into an ambush so legally and socially devastating they would never recover. I smiled, a cold, predatory curving of my lips in the empty room. The trap was locked, and the countdown to absolute destruction had officially begun. I wasted no time. Once the audio files transferred to my cloud storage, I grabbed my keys, threw the recorders into my bag, and walked out. The drive downtown was a blur of cold focus. The Boston sky was a stormy purple, matching the dark reality of what I was about to unleash. I bypassed the law firm receptionist and pushed open the heavy door to Harrison's office. Harrison and Frank were reviewing the medical files. They looked up as I entered. I did not bother with pleasantries. I walked to the center of the room and placed the two digital voice recorders onto the polished mahogany wood. I pressed the play button on the primary device and stepped back. The audio filled the silent office. The microphones had captured everything. First came Monica's demands, followed by her absolute panic over David's permanent sterility. Then came the pivot, the exact moment a desperate woman resorted to pure evil. Monica's voice rang out venomous and sharp, explicitly threatening to go to the local news stations. She outlined her plan to falsely accuse David of being a predator, stating she would drag his honorable name through the mud unless I paid her $300,000 in cash. Then the front door opened. Harold and Susan entered the recording. I watched Harrison's face as the audio revealed my father's reaction to the medical truth. Harold read the file, realized the child was not David's, and shrugged. His cold, calculated voice filled the room, telling me the biological truth did not matter at all because I had equity and Monica desperately needed cash. Then came his ultimate betrayal, promising to back up Monica's false allegations to the press if I refused to pay. Susan's bitter voice followed, claiming I owed them because they raised me. Finally, my simulated breakdown played, concluding with their eager agreement to attend the estate execution dinner. I reached out and pressed stop. The silence that slammed into the office was entirely different from the earlier tension. This was not professional outrage. This was a lethal, suffocating, ice-cold fury. David had been more than just a junior partner to Harrison. David had been his protege, his friend, and the closest thing the older man had to a son. To hear my family willingly agree to falsely paint a deceased honorable man as a monster, strictly for financial gain, crossed a line so profound, it fundamentally altered the atmosphere in the room. Frank shook his head in absolute disgust. He looked at the voice recorder as if it were a physical piece of garbage. "I have worked homicide cases with suspects who had better moral compasses than your parents," Frank muttered. "That is textbook felony extortion. They handed you their own arrest warrants on a silver platter." Harrison walked over to his desk, his face a mask of terrifying composure. He picked up his phone and dialed a direct extension. He called a high-ranking detective commander in the Fraud and Extortion Division, a contact he had cultivated over 30 years of practicing corporate law. "Arthur," Harrison said, his voice deadly quiet, "I need your team in my office within the hour. I have a multi-count felony extortion case involving a forged will, interstate wire fraud, and a conspiracy to blackmail the widow of my late partner for $300,000. We have the forged documents. We have the certified medical records proving the underlying claim is a biological impossibility. And we have high-grade audio recordings of the perpetrators explicitly outlining the blackmail plot and agreeing to collect the funds." Harrison paused, listening to the detective. He looked across the desk at me, his gray eyes locking onto mine with unwavering support. "The perpetrators are her parents and sister." Harrison continued. "We are setting up a sting operation this Friday, under the guise of a formal settlement dinner. I want plainclothes officers in the room when the money is demanded and the forged documents are presented for signature. We will lock them away for a long time." When the detectives arrived, we laid out the strategy. The authorities took possession of the forged will for forensic analysis. They secured copies of the recordings and verified the medical records, confirming David's surgical history. The lead detective explained the legal mechanics of the sting. To ensure maximum sentencing guidelines for felony extortion, we needed Monica, Harold, and Susan to actively attempt to finalize the transaction. We needed them to verbally reiterate their demands and reach for the check. The moment they attempted to execute the fraudulent transfer, the crime would be entirely complete, leaving no room to claim it was just an empty threat. I needed a venue that provided the perfect combination of absolute privacy and devastating public exposure. I wanted them surrounded by luxury to feed their delusions of grandeur, but I also wanted the people who slandered me to witness the exact moment the hammer fell. I wanted them to see the destruction of the golden child with their own eyes. I picked up my phone and called the most exclusive steakhouse in the financial district. I booked their premier private dining room, a lavish soundproofed space with mahogany-paneled walls, crystal chandeliers, and a massive oak table that seated 20 people. I paid for the room and a premium catered menu up front, ensuring the restaurant staff would give us absolute privacy until I gave a specific signal. Then I turned my attention to the guest list. Monica and my parents believed this was a private legal negotiation, but I was not about to let the people who had gleefully participated in my public crucifixion off the hook. I drafted a formal email and sent it directly to Aunt Martha, Cousin Greg, and every single relative who had left vile condemning comments on the fraudulent GoFundMe campaign. I titled the invitation as a formal wealth transfer and reconciliation dinner. I wrote that after much reflection and public feedback, I had decided to officially transfer a massive portion of David's estate to Monica and Leo. I invited them to witness the signing of the documents and celebrate the joining of our family. I knew their innate greed, their love for drama, and their desire to gloat over my apparent defeat would guarantee a 100% attendance rate. They would never miss the opportunity to watch me hand over my wealth. The next 48 hours were an agonizing, grueling exercise in absolute patience. I stayed off social media, completely ignoring the continuous influx of hateful messages and toxic business reviews. I watched from afar as the GoFundMe campaign swelled past $50,000, silently cataloging every single dollar as another count of wire fraud that would be tacked onto Monica's rapidly growing indictment. My parents texted me twice, reminding me to ensure the bank drafts were certified and to wear something appropriate for a formal gathering. I replied with simple affirmations, playing the role of the broken daughter right up to the last second. Finally, Friday night arrived. The private dining room at the steakhouse was breathtaking. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn over the windows, shutting out the bustling city outside. The long oak table was set with pristine white linens, polished silver, and gleaming crystal water glasses. Harrison sat beside me at the head of the table, flanked by two other senior partners from his firm. They wore immaculate suits, looking every bit the part of high-powered estate executors. Positioned discreetly at a smaller table near the back exit were three individuals dressed in casual business attire. They looked like junior paralegals brought along to handle paperwork. In reality, they were highly trained armed detectives from the Fraud and Extortion Division, wearing concealed high-definition body cameras to record the entire proceeding from start to finish. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors of the private room swung open. The extended family members poured in first. Aunt Martha and Cousin Greg practically vibrated with smug satisfaction, taking their seats along the sides of the table with eager, expectant smiles. They whispered quietly among themselves, shooting me victorious, condescending glances as they eagerly anticipated my formal public surrender. Then finally came the absolute guests of honor. Monica, Harold, and Susan swaggered boldly into the private room. They had very clearly spent the last 3 days shopping. Monica was wearing a brand new, wildly expensive designer dress that still had the faint crease of a fresh retail bag. She clutched a luxury purse that retailed for more than my first car. Susan draped a completely unnecessary fur wrap over her shoulders, while Harold wore a brand new tailored suit and a flashy gold watch. They were radiating arrogant entitlement, entirely blinded by their own phenomenal greed. They took their seats directly across from me, fully expecting to walk out of that room $1/3 million richer. Monica strutted to her seat like royalty. She dropped her brand new Chanel bag onto the empty chair beside her. Susan followed close behind, adjusting her unnecessary fur wrap, while Harold buttoned his tailored suit jacket, his eyes scanning the luxurious mahogany-paneled room with sheer unadulterated greed. They had clearly spent the last 3 days blowing up their remaining credit limits on a massive shopping spree, utterly convinced that my $300,000 check would clear all their debts by morning. Aunt Martha and Cousin Greg practically vibrated in their seats as the trio approached the long oak table. Martha leaned across the pristine white linen tablecloth, whispering loudly enough for the entire room to hear. She praised Monica for her incredible bravery, calling her a fierce survivor who was finally getting the justice she deserved. Greg offered Harold a firm handshake. The rest of the extended family murmured their agreement, casting judgmental glances in my direction. I sat quietly at the center of the table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I played the role of the broken, humiliated woman flawlessly. Harrison sat completely motionless at the far end of the table, his posture rigidly straight. His heavy leather briefcase sat securely by his feet, containing the forged documents and the certified bank drafts they all lusted after. Tucked away at a smaller table near the back exit, the three undercover detectives from the Fraud and Extortion Division blended perfectly into the background. They occasionally shuffled stacks of blank legal paper, but their hidden high-definition body cameras were angled precisely toward my parents and my sister, capturing every smug smile and arrogant gesture. Harold immediately took absolute control of the evening. He snapped his fingers at the head waiter, demanding the premium reserve wine list. He pointed directly to a vintage bottle of Dom Perignon, ordering 3 bottles for the table. I watched in utter silence as the waitstaff popped the corks and poured the golden liquid into their crystal flutes. Monica raised her glass high in the air. She offered a mocking theatrical toast to family loyalty, staring straight into my eyes as she drank my supposed surrender. The ordering process was a masterclass in gluttony. My family treated the menu like a blank check, fully aware that I was footing the entire bill for this extravagant estate execution dinner. Monica ordered the imported Japanese Wagyu beef, adding a butter-poached lobster tail, just because she could. Susan requested the most expensive seafood tower the kitchen could assemble, while Harold ordered a massive dry-aged tomahawk steak. They barked orders at the waitstaff, treating them with a disgusting level of disrespect that made my skin crawl. They were drunk on their own perceived power. I ordered a simple garden salad. I sat silently picking at the green leaves, letting them rack up an astronomical bill. The conversation around the table was absolutely sickening. Aunt Martha leaned over her plate of oysters, loudly lecturing me about the sanctity of motherhood. She claimed that Leo needed a stable environment, and that keeping David's money from the boy would have been an unforgivable sin against God. Cousin Greg chimed in between bites of steak, bragging to the table about how he had always known I would eventually do the right thing once the community applied enough public pressure. Every single syllable they uttered was an agonizing assault on my patience. They genuinely believed they were the righteous heroes of this fabricated tragedy. I simply swallowed my pride and endured the verbal abuse, letting them dig their metaphorical graves deeper with every passing second. Susan dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. "This is truly for the best, Joanna," she announced, her voice dripping with toxic sympathy. "You need to let go of your anger. Giving Monica her rightful share of the estate will help you heal. It is time to stop being so selfish." I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes fixed on my half-empty salad plate. "Yes, Mom," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound small and entirely defeated. "I understand." Monica chuckled, a sharp, vindictive sound that cut through the clinking of expensive silverware. She leaned back in her plush leather chair, swirling the champagne in her glass. She began loudly describing the luxury penthouse apartment she planned to rent in the city's most exclusive district. She talked about hiring a full-time nanny for Leo and booking a 2-week vacation to the Maldives. She was openly spending my money, practically rubbing the $300,000 in my face before the check had even been printed. Harold nodded approvingly, slicing into his tomahawk steak. "You deserve it, sweetheart," he told Monica. "You have fought a hard battle. It is time you reaped the rewards." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They were sitting in a room I paid for, eating food I bought, drinking champagne I funded, and openly planning how to spend the money they were currently extorting from me. Harrison remained perfectly still at the end of the table. He did not touch his food. He simply watched them, his cold gray eyes cataloging every single admission of greed. The undercover detectives at the back table continued their silent surveillance, their hidden cameras gathering insurmountable evidence against everyone involved in the ongoing conspiracy. As the dinner progressed, the volume in the room grew steadily louder. The extended family became increasingly rowdy, emboldened by the free-flowing premium alcohol. They traded stories about David casually rewriting his history to fit their twisted narrative. They painted him as a tragic, flawed man who had made a terrible mistake but ultimately wanted to do right by his secret child. It took every ounce of my willpower to keep my hands folded in my lap. Listening to them desecrate my husband's memory was a special kind of psychological torture. But I held my ground. I knew the trap required them to be completely relaxed, entirely confident, and utterly oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. Finally, the heavy oak doors swung open and the waitstaff entered to clear away the remnants of the feast. They removed the empty oyster shells, the stripped lobster tails, and the polished steak bones. The table was wiped clean, leaving only the crystal glasses and the half-empty bottles of vintage champagne. The head waiter stepped forward, holding a stack of leather-bound dessert menus, preparing to offer the table a selection of decadent sweets. Harold abruptly raised his hand, waving the waiter away with a sharp, impatient gesture. "That is enough food," Harold declared loudly, his booming voice silencing the ambient chatter of the extended family. "We did not come here to eat cake. We came here to handle family business." He turned his predatory gaze toward me, then shifted his attention to Harrison, sitting at the far end of the table. Harold leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, his face flushed from the alcohol and the thrill of the impending kill. "Let us skip the pleasantries and get straight to the signing of the checks," Harold demanded, his tone shifting from arrogant guest to aggressive negotiator. "Monica has a child to take care of, and we have wasted enough time. Bring out the estate documents, present the non-disclosure agreements, and hand over the $300,000. We are ready to close this transaction right now." Monica sat up perfectly straight, her eyes locked onto Harrison's leather briefcase. Susan crossed her arms, nodding in absolute agreement with my father. Aunt Martha and Cousin Greg leaned in, eager to witness the final humiliating surrender of my assets. The entire room fell into a heavy, expectant hush. The extortion plot was explicitly laid out on the table, verbally confirmed in a room full of witnesses and hidden police cameras. They had officially crossed the point of no return. I slowly placed my folded white linen napkin on the polished wood table. I took a very deep, steadying breath, feeling the cold, clinical precision wash over my mind, instantly replacing the simulated grief. The act was finally officially over. I pushed my heavy leather dining chair back and stood up straight at the head of the long oak table. I looked at Harold, then at Susan, and finally at Monica. Their smug, triumphant smiles began to falter, replaced by a sudden creeping uncertainty as they registered the drastic, sudden change in my posture. The defeated, broken widow was gone. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small black plastic remote control. I held it up for a fraction of a second, letting the dark silence stretch across the dining room. I calmly pressed the center button. A low, mechanical whirring sound echoed through the room. Everyone turned their heads, watching in sudden confusion as a massive high-definition projector screen slowly descended from the ceiling directly behind me, silencing the entire room. The mechanical hum of the descending projector screen completely swallowed the arrogant laughter that had filled the private dining room seconds before. The heavy canvas locked into place with a sharp click, casting a stark, bright square of white light against the dark mahogany panels. The extended family froze, their crystal champagne flutes suspended halfway to their mouths. Aunt Martha blinked in profound confusion, while Cousin Greg shifted uncomfortably in his plush leather seat. Across the table, the triumphant, greedy smiles plastered across the faces of my parents and my sister instantly dissolved into identical masks of bewildered irritation. Monica aggressively crossed her arms over her chest, the fabric of her brand-new designer dress rustling loudly in the sudden quiet. She glared at me, her eyes narrowing as she tried to comprehend the unexpected visual aid. Harold slammed his palm flat against the polished oak table, his face flushing a deep, angry red as his anticipated financial victory was abruptly interrupted. "What kind of theatrical stunt is this?" Harold demanded, his voice thick with impatient authority. "We are not here to watch a slideshow, Joanna. Hand over the certified bank drafts so your sister can leave this miserable situation behind her." I remained standing perfectly straight at the head of the table, my posture radiating an absolute, unshakable calm. I looked down at my father, feeling nothing but a profound, icy detachment. "Before we discuss inheritances, we need to clear up some biology," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy air with lethal precision. I raised the small black remote control and pressed the forward button. The projector clicked loudly. A massive high-definition image illuminated the screen behind me. It was a side-by-side comparison of two legal documents blown up to a scale that made every single detail impossible to ignore. On the left side of the screen was a scanned copy of David's actual legally binding last will and testament. It featured the official embossed letterhead of Harrison's prestigious downtown law firm, complete with proper margin formatting, complex legal terminology, and the authentic flowing signatures of two senior partners who had served as official witnesses. On the right side of the screen was the document Monica had proudly brandished during her vile extortion campaign. Blown up to this massive size, the fraudulent nature of her offering was spectacularly obvious. The formatting was entirely incorrect, utilizing a standard word processor template that lacked any professional legal structure. The language was clumsy and melodramatic, completely devoid of the clinical precision an actual attorney would employ. But the most devastating piece of evidence rested at the very bottom of the page. I tapped the remote again, and the projector zoomed in tightly on the two signatures. The signature on the left, David's authentic handwriting, was sharp, angular, and distinct. The signature on the right, the one Monica had submitted as proof of her fabricated claim, was a shaky, hesitant tracing. The connecting stroke between the letters was thick and uncertain. The final loop was exaggerated and sloppy, bearing the unmistakable hallmark of someone attempting to copy a signature from a photograph rather than producing it naturally. Harrison remained seated at the end of the table, resting his hands casually over his leather briefcase. He did not need to stand or shout to command absolute authority. He simply looked down the length of the table at Monica. As the senior partner of the firm that handled David's estate, I can assure everyone in this room that the document on the right is a complete and utter fabrication. Harrison stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded immediate silence. The legal header is fake. The witness signatures do not belong to any paralegals employed at my firm. Furthermore, creating and attempting to execute a fraudulent will in this state is a severe felony carrying mandatory prison time. A collective, horrified gasp echoed around the large oak table. Aunt Martha dropped her linen napkin onto her plate, her eyes darting frantically between the projector screen and my sister. Cousin Greg leaned forward, his mouth opening in absolute shock as he stared at the poorly traced signature. The extended family, the exact same people who had spent the last 3 days publicly crucifying my character on social media, were suddenly confronted with the undeniable reality that they had been viciously manipulated. Monica's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white. She shrank back into her chair, her arrogant swagger evaporating instantly. Susan grabbed Harold's arm, her manicured fingernails digging into his suit jacket as panic finally began to set in. "This is a trick!" Susan shrieked, her voice pitching upward in desperation. She pointed an accusing finger at me. "Joanna is trying to manipulate the evidence to avoid paying her sister. That signature is real. David signed that paper because he wanted to provide for his biological son." I did not react to her screaming. I simply looked at my mother with a gaze so entirely devoid of emotion that she physically recoiled. "His biological son," I repeated, letting the words hang in the silent room. I tapped the remote control one more time. The image of the two wills vanished from the screen. In their place, a new document appeared, illuminated in stark, unforgiving detail. It was a certified official medical record from Massachusetts General Hospital. The hospital letterhead was prominent and undeniable. The dates were highlighted in bright yellow marker, drawing the eye directly to the center of the page. At the bottom rested the bold, authentic signature of a leading urological surgeon. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the screen. "As you all know, David and I struggled with fertility for many years." I explained, my voice echoing clearly across the vast dining room. "What we never shared with the family, primarily because we valued our privacy and wished to avoid the exact kind of toxic judgment currently occurring at this table, was the final medical conclusion of our journey. 3 years ago, David developed a severe medical issue that required an invasive surgical procedure. During that procedure, due to significant complications, his surgeon strongly recommended a permanent solution to prevent future life-threatening recurrences." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the faces of my extended family, watching the terrifying realization begin to dawn on them. David had a full, irreversible vasectomy. I stated, my words dropping like heavy stones into the silent room. The document behind me is his certified surgical record. The procedure was performed, finalized, and deemed entirely successful. I pointed to the highlighted yellow dates on the screen. That surgery took place exactly 2 years and 4 months before little Leo was even conceived. I continued, ensuring every single syllable was heard clearly by everyone in the room. "I want you all to look at the dates. I want you to look at the surgeon's signature. I want you to do the basic, undeniable math." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. I could practically hear the gears turning in the minds of my aunts, uncles, and cousins as they processed the devastating biological timeline. David was completely sterile 2 years before Monica ever claimed to have slept with him. The entire foundation of her tragic star-crossed romance was a physical impossibility. The secret orphan narrative was a complete fabricated delusion. Aunt Martha covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with mounting horror. She slowly turned her head to look at Monica, her expression shifting from supportive sympathy to profound aggressive disgust. Cousin Greg sank back into his chair, running a trembling hand over his face. He had donated $500 to that fraudulent GoFundMe campaign. He had tagged local news stations demanding they investigate my supposed cruelty. He had publicly slandered a grieving widow based entirely on a lie that defied basic human biology. Whispers of absolute outrage began to ripple through the extended family. They muttered to each other, their voices rising in volume, as the sheer magnitude of the deception became entirely clear. They realized they had been conned. They realized they had been used as gullible attack dogs to facilitate a criminal extortion scheme. The wealthy, respectable family image they prized above all else was currently burning to the ground in the middle of a high-end steakhouse. Susan tried to stand up, her face a mask of frantic denial, but Harold yanked her back down into her seat. My father stared at the medical records on the screen, his jaw working furiously as he realized the trap had just snapped shut around his own ankles. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew the authorities would not view his participation kindly. Monica completely lost her mind. The sudden destruction of her impending payday combined with the intense judgmental glaring of the entire extended family shattered whatever fragile composure she had left. She leaped out of her plush leather chair, knocking it backward so forcefully it crashed into the mahogany-paneled wall. She slammed both of her hands down onto the grand oak table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes and sending silverware clattering against the fine china plates. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her eyes bulging with desperate fury. "Those are fake!" Monica screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the ceiling. She pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my face. "You forged those medical records. You paid a doctor to write that. David is Leo's father. He told me he was. He promised me he would take care of us. You are just a jealous, barren witch who cannot stand the fact that your husband wanted me instead of you." Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, entirely abandoning the grieving mother persona she had maintained online. She was a cornered animal lashing out with raw, vicious desperation. "I do not care about your stupid slideshow," Monica shrieked, slamming her fist against the table again. "We had a deal. You brought us here to sign the papers. I want my money. Give me my $300,000 right now, or I swear I will walk straight out of this restaurant and tell every news station in Boston that David forced himself on me. I will ruin his name forever. Give me the check." Harold jumped up, reaching out to grab Monica's arm to silence her, finally realizing she was actively committing verbal extortion in front of 20 witnesses. Susan burst into tears, realizing their luxurious lifestyle and pristine social standing were rapidly disintegrating before her very eyes. I did not yell back. I did not match her frantic screaming energy. I simply stood there, an anchor of absolute calm amidst the chaotic storm she was generating. I looked at Monica, watching her chest heave, watching the sheer panic radiate from her pores. I slowly raised my hand, silencing the murmuring crowd of aunts and uncles. I brought the small black remote control back up, pointing it squarely at the projector system. I tapped the center button one final time, clearing the medical records from the screen entirely. I hit play on the attached audio file. The sound system in the private dining room was exceptional. The high-definition speakers flawlessly broadcast the recording I had retrieved from beneath my coffee table. The crisp, clear sound of Monica's own voice instantly filled the room, utterly toxic and completely unmistakable. The recording captured her vile, calculating tone perfectly. It played her explicit threat to falsely accuse David of being a predator. It played her detailed step-by-step plan to ruin his honorable reputation unless I handed over the $300,000 in cash. The trap was fully sprung, and there was absolutely no escape. The audio from my living room filled the private dining space. The steakhouse speakers were crisp, capturing the malice in my sister's voice with terrifying clarity. The extended family sat frozen in dead silence, their eyes wide and horrified, as Monica's recorded words ripped through the air. Her voice echoed off the mahogany walls, casually admitting that David was not the father of her child. The room listened as she callously laughed about the biological impossibility, dismissing the lie she had spent 3 days selling to the public. Then came the devastating pivot. The audio captured her explicit, sickening threat to falsely accuse a dead man of being a predator. The extended family heard her lay out the brutal mathematics of her extortion plot, demanding exactly $300,000 to keep her mouth shut and clear her debts. Aunt Martha slumped back into her leather chair as if physically struck. Cousin Greg stared at his wine glass, his face twisting into a mask of pure revulsion. The people who had gleefully condemned me online were now forced to listen to the unfiltered reality of my sister's criminal mind. They heard the raw greed that fueled her every word. Monica sat paralyzed at the center of the table. Her jaw hung open, her eyes darting frantically around the room as she searched for an escape. The triumphant swagger she had paraded into the restaurant with evaporated, replaced by the suffocating terror of a cornered animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. But the audio recording was not finished. The track seamlessly transitioned to the moment the front door of my house had opened. Heavy footsteps echoed through the speakers, followed by the booming voice of my father. Harold's recorded voice dismissed the medical records entirely. The room listened in stunned disbelief as he callously stated that the biological truth did not matter because Monica needed the cash and I had equity. The extended family heard him explicitly validate the extortion plot. They heard Harold coldly threaten to back up Monica's false allegations to the local press if I refused to pay the ransom. He was willing to publicly annihilate the reputation of a decent man who was no longer here to defend himself, all to secure a bailout for his child. Before the shock of Harold's betrayal could fully settle over the dining room, my mother's voice pierced the silence. Susan's recorded tone was sharp, bitter, and devoid of maternal affection. She demanded the money, insisting that I owed them for raising me. She explicitly threatened to ruin my life and David's legacy if I did not comply with their criminal demands. The audio captured their eager agreement to attend this dinner under the guise of a formal wealth transfer. The recording ended with the heavy thud of my front door closing, leaving a ringing silence in the room. I stood perfectly still at the head of the long oak table, my face a mask of cold resolve. I watched the color drain from my parents' faces. All the artificial bravado, all the arrogant entitlement they had carried into the restaurant vanished in an instant. Harold's deeply tanned face turned a sickly gray. He stared at the blank projector screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Susan clutched her expensive fur wrap tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with sudden panic. She looked at the extended family, desperately seeking a friendly face, but she found nothing but disgust. Aunt Martha stood up from her chair, her hands shaking with fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my mother. "You lied to us," Martha shouted, her voice echoing sharply. "You sat in my kitchen, you cried fake tears, and you swore to me that David had abandoned your daughter. You used us to destroy Joanna's reputation. You used our money to fund your sick games." Cousin Greg pushed his chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He glared at Harold with a look of profound contempt. "You are a monster, Uncle Harold." Greg spat out, his voice thick with anger. "You were going to let the city believe David was a predator just to pay off Monica's credit card bills. You made us accomplices to this garbage. I want my donation back right now." The extended family erupted into a chaotic chorus of shouting and demands. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had eagerly participated in my public crucifixion were now turning their combined wrath onto the true villains of the story. They realized how deeply they had been manipulated. They recognized that they had been weaponized in a desperate criminal extortion scheme, and they were furious. Monica tried to speak, her voice a high, panicked squeak over the rising volume of the room. "It is a fake," she stammered, waving her hands frantically. Joanna hired someone to fake that recording. She is trying to set us up. We would never say those things. It is an artificial intelligence voice clone. You have to believe me." Nobody believed her. The sheer desperation in her voice only confirmed her overwhelming guilt. The audio quality was far too crisp, the cadence of their voices far too natural to be dismissed as a digital fabrication. The raw malice in the recording was undeniable, and everyone in the room recognized the unmistakable cruelty of my family. Harold finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. His corporate survival instincts kicked in, overriding his shock. He knew that arguing with the extended family was pointless. He knew the audio recording was a definitive, unshakable piece of evidence that could destroy his life. He looked at Susan, his eyes wide with sudden terror. "We need to leave," Harold hissed, grabbing his wife by the arm. "We need to get out of this building right now." Susan stumbled to her feet, her chair tipping backward and crashing to the floor. She did not bother to pick it up. She dropped her designer handbag onto the table, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she realized the catastrophic legal implications of the recording. They had been caught executing a multi-count felony, and the evidence was sitting right on the table. Monica scrambled out of her plush leather seat, her face twisted in pure panic. She abandoned her expensive champagne flute, pushing past her furious relatives as she desperately tried to follow her parents. They moved together as a frantic, terrified unit, abandoning all pretense of dignity or innocence. They wanted to flee into the anonymity of the city streets before the consequences of their actions could materialize. They shoved their way past the shouting extended family members, their new clothes brushing against the furious aunts and uncles they had callously deceived. Harold led the charge, his face slick with a cold sweat. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the room, viewing them as his only salvation. He believed that if he could just get out of the restaurant, he could hire a defense attorney and spin new lies to protect himself. Susan practically clung to his suit jacket, dragging Monica along behind her. They reached the end of the long oak table just a few feet away from the exit. The chaotic noise of the dining room faded into a dull roar as their singular focus narrowed entirely on escaping the trap I had so carefully constructed. They reached out their hands trembling as they prepared to push open the heavy wooden doors and disappear into the night. Harrison slowly stood up from his chair. The senior law partner moved with a calm, terrifying grace that instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. He stepped out from behind the oak table and planted himself directly in front of the exit. He crossed his arms over his chest, his broad shoulders blocking the double doors of the private dining room. He did not rush. He did not shout. He simply stood there, an immovable, towering wall of legal authority, cutting off their only avenue of escape. The three individuals sitting at the smaller table near the back exit simultaneously pushed their chairs back and stood up. They shed their unassuming demeanor instantly, their posture shifting into rigid professional readiness. The hidden high-definition body cameras secured to their clothing continued to record every moment of the escalating confrontation. They moved to flank Harrison, creating a solid, impenetrable barricade between my terrified family and the freedom they so desperately sought. Harold stopped dead in his tracks, nearly colliding with Harrison's chest. Susan let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her eyes darting wildly between the towering attorney and the three stern individuals standing beside him. Monica shrank back against her mother, her face completely drained of color, as the absolute horrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. Harrison slowly and deliberately adjusted his tailored suit jacket, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle on his lapel. He looked down at my terrified father, his gray eyes cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of mercy. He let the deafening silence stretch for a fraction of a second, ensuring that every single person in the room was listening intently to his next words. "I am afraid this dinner party is not quite over yet," Harrison calmly announced to the room, his low, resonant voice echoing clearly over the stunned silence of the extended family. "Forging a testamentary document and conspiring to extort money are severe felonies. You are not going anywhere tonight." Harrison's words hung in the air, thick and inescapable. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany double doors swung open, pushing past Harrison's broad shoulders. 2 uniformed police officers stepped firmly into the private dining room, their commanding presence instantly draining whatever oxygen remained in the space. They were flanked by a seasoned detective in a sharp gray trench coat, his silver badge catching the bright glare of the crystal chandeliers hanging above. The 3 undercover detectives who had been posing as junior paralegals seamlessly moved to join their arriving colleagues, flashing their own badges and effectively sealing the room from the inside out. The steakhouse waitstaff had completely vanished, leaving my family isolated in a perfectly orchestrated nightmare of their own making. The sudden crackle of a police radio shattered the silence, a harsh mechanical sound that officially transformed this luxurious dining room into an active crime scene. The loud clatter of dropped silverware echoed across the room. Cousin Greg shrank back into his plush chair, trying to make himself as invisible as physically possible. Aunt Martha clutched her chest, her face pale with genuine shock as she stared at the armed officers. Monica stood completely frozen, her eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at the uniforms as if they were terrifying apparitions sent to collect her soul. Harold took a clumsy, uncoordinated step backward, bumping hard into the edge of the grand oak table. His mind was desperately searching for a corporate loophole, a clever negotiation tactic, or a bribe that could fix this disaster. But his business acumen was utterly useless against criminal arrest warrants. Susan let out a high, thin wail, burying her face in her trembling hands to block out the horrific reality. Harrison moved with the calm, practiced efficiency of a man who had orchestrated hundreds of high-stakes legal maneuvers over a long, ruthless career. He stepped toward the lead detective and hoisted his heavy leather briefcase onto the nearest empty serving table. He clicked the brass locks open with a sharp metallic snap that made Harold flinch. "Here is the physical evidence we discussed earlier today." Detective Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "Inside this briefcase, you will find the fraudulent last will and testament presented to my client tonight for execution. You will also find the certified medical records proving the biological impossibility of the underlying paternity claim. Finally, there is a highly secure flash drive containing the high-definition audio recordings of the explicit extortion demands made against my client in her own home, as well as the unedited footage from the hidden cameras your undercover officers recorded during this dinner." The detective nodded firmly, taking possession of the heavy briefcase. He surveyed the terrified trio standing at the head of the long table. The air in the room was so thick with tension it felt physically suffocating. The detective pulled a small black notebook from his breast pocket, flipped it open, and looked directly at my sister. "Monica Brianna Wilson," he announced, his voice devoid of any emotion, cold and entirely professional. "You are under arrest for the forgery of a testamentary document, attempted grand larceny, and multiple counts of felony extortion." Monica let out a visceral, guttural scream. The polished, arrogant facade she had worn into the restaurant completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "No," she shrieked, backing away until her shoulders hit the mahogany-paneled wall. "You cannot do this. It is a terrible misunderstanding. Joanna is lying to you. I did not do anything wrong. I am a mother. You cannot take me away from my child." The detective signaled to one of the uniformed officers. The officer stepped forward, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical protests. He grabbed her arm swiftly, turning her around and pressing her firmly against the expensive wood paneling. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed louder than any shout. That sound finalized the absolute destruction of her golden child status. She was wearing a brand new, wildly expensive designer dress purchased with the arrogant expectation of stolen wealth, and now her hands were bound tightly behind her back in cheap, cold metal. Her brand new Chanel bag sat abandoned on her dining chair, a pathetic monument to her failed greed. She thrashed against the officer's solid grip, crying uncontrollably. Mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, ruining her meticulously applied makeup. The extended family watched in paralyzed horror as the pristine, untouchable favorite daughter was reduced to a sobbing, desperate criminal in a matter of seconds. "You have the right to remain silent," the detective recited calmly over her piercing wails, stepping closer to her to ensure she heard every word. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? Monica did not answer. She just wept loudly, her knees buckling slightly as the sturdy officer held her upright. The detective then turned his steely, unforgiving gaze toward my parents. Harold raised his hands in a frantic, trembling gesture of surrender, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. We had absolutely nothing to do with the forgery, Harold blurted out instantly, throwing his favorite daughter under the bus to save his own skin. We thought the document was real. We were just here to support Monica through a difficult transition. We are completely innocent bystanders in all of this. Joanna is just trying to punish us for a family disagreement. The detective pulled out a second pair of handcuffs from his belt and signaled to the remaining officers standing near the exit. Innocent bystanders do not actively threaten to destroy a deceased man's reputation to facilitate a $300,000 blackmail plot. The detective countered sharply, shutting down Harold's pathetic lie immediately. We have you on tape, Harold. We heard every single word you and your wife said in that living room. We have you on video demanding the payout right here at this dinner table tonight. The officers moved in swiftly, grabbing Harold and Susan by the arms. Harold tried to pull away, sputtering empty legal threats and demanding to call his expensive corporate lawyer, but the officer simply twisted his arm behind his back and secured the cuffs with practiced ease. Susan screamed a shrill, piercing sound of absolute terror that rattled the crystal glasses on the table as the cold steel snapped around her delicate wrists. You are both being detained for questioning regarding your active complicity in felony extortion and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, the detective explained, his voice raising to cut through Susan's hysterical, uncontrolled crying. The authorities are also launching a full comprehensive financial investigation into the fraudulent GoFundMe campaign you actively promoted online. Every single dollar collected under false pretenses constitutes an additional count of wire fraud. You will have plenty of time to explain your involvement down at the precinct. The extended family watched the complete dismantling of my abusers in stunned, breathless silence. The people who had judged me, the people who had written vile comments about my character on social media, were now shrinking back into their seats, terrified that they might somehow be implicated in the sprawling criminal enterprise. Aunt Martha looked as though she might be physically ill, her hands trembling violently as she stared at her brother standing in handcuffs. Cousin Greg kept his eyes fixed firmly on the white tablecloth, completely avoiding my gaze. They had come to feast on my misery, and instead they were witnessing the total annihilation of the people who had invited them. The officers began to march them toward the exit. The reality of the long, humiliating walk through the crowded, high-end steakhouse suddenly dawned on Harold. He bowed his head, his face burning with a deep, inescapable shame, as he realized every wealthy, influential patron in the establishment would watch him be paraded out in handcuffs. His country club reputation was dead and buried. Susan sobbed wildly, her makeup smeared across her face. Her unnecessary fur wrap fell off her shoulders and tumbled to the floor, forgotten and trampled under the officer's heavy black boots. Monica dragged her feet, fighting the officer pulling her forward. She looked back over her shoulder with wild, pleading eyes. She searched the terrified faces of the aunts and uncles who had praised her bravery just an hour earlier, but they all turned away, utterly disgusted by her presence. She had nothing left. Monica twisted against the officer's firm grip, her tear-streaked face turning desperately toward our parents. "Mom, Dad, do something," she begged, her voice cracking with sheer terror as the reality of a cold prison cell loomed before her. "Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them to let me go. Please, you have to protect me. You promised me this would work." Harold could not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the floor, consumed entirely by his own impending ruin and the shattering of his untouchable ego. Susan just wailed louder, completely paralyzed by the realization that her life of luxury was permanently over. As the officer shoved Monica forward, forcing her toward the heavy double doors, I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I walked around the edge of the grand oak table, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I stopped right in front of Harold, standing tall and unbroken. I forced him to lift his head. I looked my father dead in the eye, watching the sheer panic and absolute defeat swirl in his gaze. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a cold, steady whisper that carried perfectly across the silent, shocked room. Family protects family, remember. I did not wait for Harold to answer. I turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room, leaving my parents and my sister to the devastating reality of their own calculated choices. The cool night air hit my face as I exited the steakhouse, washing away the lingering stench of their greed. I drove home in absolute silence. The next morning, I wasted no time. My first call was to a local locksmith. By 10 o'clock in the morning, every single exterior and interior lock on my doors had been completely and securely replaced by commercial-grade hardware. The house felt lighter, immediately purged of the creeping threat that my family might ever try to violate my sanctuary again. The legal fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Monica was formally charged with multiple counts of felony forgery, attempted grand larceny, and felony extortion. Because she had actively conspired to execute the fraudulent document across state lines using digital communications and internet fundraising platforms, the federal authorities took an incredibly keen, aggressive interest in her high-profile case. The Golden Child was facing decades in state and federal prison. To keep their favorite daughter out of a concrete cell, Harold and Susan were forced to drain every single account they possessed. They hired the most aggressively expensive defense attorneys in Boston, but the evidence I had provided was insurmountable. The audio recordings, the hidden camera footage, the forged signatures, and David's certified medical records formed a titanium cage around them. The financial bleeding did not stop at legal fees. The authorities mandated full restitution for the fraudulent GoFundMe campaign, demanding that every single dollar be returned to the donors with interest. Harold and Susan were forced into absolute financial ruin. They had to immediately liquidate their investment portfolios, drain their retirement accounts, and surrender their luxury vehicles. Finally, they were forced to put their pristine suburban home on the market at a massive loss, just to cover the skyrocketing attorney retainers, exorbitant legal fees, and severe court fines. Watching them lose the physical symbol of their arrogant status was profoundly poetic. The social destruction was even more profound than their financial collapse. The extended family, furious at being weaponized in a criminal extortion scheme, completely excommunicated them. Aunt Martha led the charge, ensuring that every relative, family, friend, and business associate knew exactly what Harold, Susan, and Monica had attempted to do. The prestigious country club Harold prized above his own soul officially revoked their membership, sending a highly publicized letter citing severe moral turpitude. They became utter pariahs in their own community, forced to move into a cramped, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. They had sacrificed everything to steal my wealth, and they were left with absolutely nothing. While they were losing their world, I was busy expanding mine. I contacted a premier real estate agent and listed my Beacon Hill home. The market was incredibly aggressive, and my beautifully renovated property instantly sparked a fierce bidding war. Within 4 days, the house sold for a massive, unprecedented profit, far exceeding the initial $600,000 valuation. I packed up the life David and I had built carefully, wrapping our memories and shipping them across the country. I was done with Boston. I was done with the cold winters, and I was entirely done with the toxic bloodline that had tried to bury me. I eagerly relocated my entire life to the Pacific Northwest, embracing the refreshing anonymity of a brand new city. I took the massive profits from the sale of my house and purchased a breathtaking modern property in Seattle. It was a sprawling, light-filled penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the deep blue waters of Puget Sound. The space was pristine, open, and utterly mine. I decorated it with the vibrant artwork David had always loved, creating a sanctuary that honored his memory without keeping me chained to the past. Professionally, I completely rebranded and relocated my wealth management firm. The move allowed me to tap into an entirely new market of high net worth clients in the tech industry. I worked relentlessly channeling the sharp analytical focus that had saved my life into building my business. Without the constant draining weight of my family's manufactured drama pulling me down, my firm absolutely exploded. Within a year, my client roster had tripled, my professional reputation was absolutely spotless, and my personal wealth far exceeded the estate my family had so desperately tried to steal. I was thriving on a level they could never even comprehend. But personal success was not enough. I wanted to ensure that the horrific abuse I had survived resulted in something genuinely meaningful. I took a significant portion of my new profits and officially established a legal aid foundation in David's name. The foundation was specifically designed to provide top-tier legal representation and financial planning to victims of financial family abuse. I hired aggressive, brilliant attorneys who specialized in untangling toxic estate battles, protecting vulnerable widows, dismantling sophisticated financial abuse networks, and exposing fraudulent family claims. We funded investigations, covered court fees, and provided secure housing for individuals fleeing extortion from their own relatives. I turned David's legacy into a powerful, unyielding shield for people who were experiencing the exact nightmare my family had put me through. My phone no longer rang with frantic, demanding calls from Susan. I received no passive-aggressive text messages from Harold complaining about my lack of loyalty. Monica's daily barrage of toxic insults was permanently silenced by a court-ordered restraining order and the overwhelming reality of her impending criminal trial. The absolute silence from my past was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I had successfully severed every single tie to my toxic bloodline. They were nothing more than a cautionary tale, a dark chapter in a book I had firmly closed and placed back on the shelf. The transition was not without its moments of profound grief. I still missed David every single day. I missed his laugh, his calm logic, and the way he made me feel entirely safe. But the grief was no longer tainted by the desperate clawing greed of my parents and the venomous deceit of my sister. I was allowed to mourn him in peace, honoring the man he actually was, rather than the fictional monster my family had tried to invent. 1 year after the sting operation at the steakhouse, I finalized the largest client acquisition in my firm's history. It was a Friday evening. The Seattle sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple as the sun slowly dipped below the distant mountains. I walked through my quiet, pristine penthouse, the hardwood floors cool against my bare feet. I carefully opened an expensive bottle of vintage wine, the exact same robust vintage David and I had joyfully shared on our wedding night, and poured myself a generous, deep red glass. I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony. The vibrant city hummed quietly far below me, a spectacular river of shimmering lights winding beautifully through the darkening urban landscape. The crisp, salty air off the sound filled my lungs. I took a slow sip of the rich wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I leaned against the sturdy glass railing, looking out over the vast open horizon. I thought about the terrified, grieving woman who had sat in Harrison's office listening to her sister demand $300,000. I thought about the broken daughter who had believed her parents would eventually choose to love her. That naive woman was permanently gone. In her place stood someone formidable, someone fundamentally forged in the absolute hottest, most destructive fires of emotional betrayal and psychological deceit. I had taken their worst blows, their most calculated cruelty, and I had used it to build an empire of my own making. I raised my glass slightly, offering a silent toast to the empty sky. I had protected my husband's legacy. I had defended my own life. I had secured my future. I stood alone on my balcony, entirely unbothered by the miserable, ruined lives my family was currently leading back in Boston. I took another sip of wine, wrapping myself in the quiet, unshakable comfort of my new reality. The air was cool, the wine was perfect, and the silence was absolute. I smiled, realizing the fundamental truth that had carried me through the darkest days of my life. The absolute sweetest revenge is not anger and it is not destruction. The sweetest revenge is massive success, total peace, and unbreakable boundaries. The story of Joanna Monica Harold and Susan serves as a powerful reminder that sharing DNA does not automatically guarantee love, loyalty, or basic respect. Society frequently conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, pressuring us to endure toxic behavior, financial abuse, and emotional manipulation simply because of a shared bloodline. However, this narrative shatters that illusion, proving that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are the ones sitting right across from us at the dinner table. The core lesson here is the absolute necessity of establishing and enforcing ironclad boundaries. Joanna's journey illustrates that you are never obligated to sacrifice your own well-being, reputation, or success to satisfy the greed or entitlement of your relatives. When family members show you their true colors, whether through deceit, extreme favoritism, or outright extortion, you must protect yourself at all costs. Healing does not always require reconciliation or forgiveness. In cases of severe toxicity, it requires a clean, decisive, and unapologetic break. Furthermore, the story brilliantly redefines the concept of vengeance. True justice against those who try to destroy you is not found in returning their cruelty or stooping to their criminal level. The sweetest, most devastating revenge is massive, unbothered success. By severing ties, walking away, and channeling her pain into building a thriving life and helping others, Joanna reclaimed her ultimate power. She proved that your value is never dictated by the people who failed to appreciate you. You have the fundamental right to walk away and rebuild your life entirely on your own terms. Tell us about a time you had to make the difficult decision to establish strict boundaries and walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace. Share your empowering story in the comments below. If Joanna's journey to freedom and massive success resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about resilience, strength, and reclaiming your life.